Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Speaker Brad Wilson. Let's see. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Welcome to the second annual Great Salt Lake Summit. Oh, that's good. Thanks, Lynn. If you haven't, grab some breakfast and settle in. I want to share with you something that's happened to me or with me over the last month. I had the opportunity to join our good Governor Cox on a trade mission to Israel. And there we witnessed something that was pretty remarkable. We witnessed how effective the Israelis have become at mastering their own water destiny as a country. This little country has figured out water than any other country, in my opinion, in the world. I walked away from that visit to Israel with a greater understanding of an even greater commitment to improving Utah's critical water system. Just as Israel has recognized, we as Utahns must treat water not as this overabundant, cheap resource that we've thought of in the past, but as a commodity that requires careful and very meticulous management. Just a couple of weeks ago, you probably all saw, as I did, the Deseret News released a poll that indicated that 80% of Utahns are very concerned about the Great Salt Lake. The reason I mention that is I find that 80% number is astounding. 80% is a huge number in today's world in public opinion polls in a very difficult and kind of challenging political climate. And I can't think of any other issue that we face as a state right now where individuals from every point on the political spectrum are united, but they are united about concerns related to the Great Salt Lake. Secondly, I actually could not imagine seeing that high of a number even 10 months ago when we first met. The general perception of the Great Salt Lake and the acknowledgement of Utahns of the challenges that we face has evolved extremely rapidly, and in my opinion, for the better. Before we get started, I want to say thank you. Thank you to a lot of different folks. Thank you to all of you for taking time away from work today or being away from your organizations. Thanks to our elected officials, federal, state, and local, for taking time also to be with us today, and for having seen the big picture, having worked to pass at a state or local level, meaningful legislation and programs and policies that are all designed for the betterment of the Great Salt Lake. I also want to thank our nonprofit organizations who played a critical role and have raised awareness of the importance of the Great Salt Lake and have also brought really creative ideas and solutions to the table. I want to have a special shout out to our friends at the Great Salt Lake, the Friends of the Great Salt Lake, and in particular, Lynn, to you for your leadership related to the lake. Yeah, so, and don't do this very often, but I want to thank our friends in the media for the great work that they've done related to the Great Salt Lake. They've really spread the message about the Great Salt Lake in a way that has engaged Utahns and helped bring us together. And I think that's a great role that they can play in times like this. I want to thank our sponsors who've actually made this day possible for stepping up and helping support this event. And you can see them listed on these slides there. Let's give them a quick round of applause if we can. Those are the folks that brought your breakfast and lunch. So, you have some gratitude for them for that. Lastly, and most importantly, I want to thank all Utahns. You've really stepped up. You've really done your part as a state. I was told by Director Ferry just this week that so far this year, Utahns have conserved and saved over 9 billion gallons of water. That is the size of Echo Reservoir, just year to date. As I've worked with many of you over the last year to address the challenges of the Great Salt Lake, I've really begun to see the lake as a symbol of a broader opportunity that we have with the way we manage water in the great state of Utah. And today's summit, while it's hyper-focused on the Great Salt Lake, we all know is just one piece of a much larger water puzzle. The lessons that we've learned so far and will learn, and the solutions that we're discussing today pertain not just to the Great Salt Lake, but really to water management statewide. With all this in mind, I want to give you an overview of what we're going to accomplish today. So let's look at the agenda there. There we go. I should have brought my glasses, but I can kind of see this TV here. So rookie mistake, I guess. So we're going to start out after a little bit more of a presentation from me with it. Will, thank you. So that's why he gets paid the big bucks. So we didn't rehearse this, can you tell? So we're going to start out with our leadoff batter, Teresa Williamson from the State Engineer's Office, and she's going to give you a fascinating overview of how water actually gets to the Great Salt Lake. And I think you'll find it interesting and a little bit more complex than maybe most of us think. Then we're going to have Brian Steed and Bill Anderegg from both Utah State and the University of Utah share with us what's really happening with water in Utah over the last 100 years, and will a wet cycle solve the problem for us? Then we'll pivot to a panel discussion led by Tage Flint around issues related to the Great Salt Lake today and kind of what's going on out there now. After a break, we'll then move into a fireside chat without a fire, and we'll have a couple of a reformed lawmaker and a current lawmaker and me talk through really the challenges and some solutions to the issues on the lake today. We'll then move into a panel discussion with some members of our federal delegation who will be here to talk with us about what the federal government can and is doing to help support Utah in our efforts to lead around the Great Salt Lake. And then lastly, and I'll just give you a teaser, we have a couple of big announcements at the end of the program today about some things that will be happening or have already happened related to the Great Salt Lake. So less than a year ago, we were all in a room similar to this, beginning this discussion. I hoped that that first summit would lead to meaningful policy change, and it would also increase our awareness about the Great Salt Lake. Well, my expectations were blown out of the water. No laughs about that. And let's take a look at what's happened over the last year. Welcome to the second annual Great Salt Lake Summit. Since we last met just over 9 months ago, much progress has been made toward protecting and preserving the Great Salt Lake. It's taken efforts from state, local, and federal levels, as well as from our partners in the private sector, but especially from individual Utahns across the state. Let's take a quick look at what's happened since we last got together.
I'm really excited about what we've done with Great Salt Lake. If you look around the world, a lot of these terminal lakes like this one have been lost. And Utah has this unique opportunity to act decisively and protect this really important resource. And we've done amazing work. 6 important pieces of legislation passed just the last session. We invested $50 million in Great Salt Lake and another $400 million in water conservation.
I feel that the efforts to fast-track conservation efforts have greatly increased over the past year or two, both because people are more aware and because it's more urgent today. The efforts that are made in House Bill 33 allow us as farmers the assurance that we can manage our water, we can conserve water, and we don't lose our opportunity for future use of that water. We can maintain beneficial use and still provide conservation, and especially conservation efforts downstream.
So I can speak on behalf of Layton City. We've done several different things. We've changed our landscaping ordinance. We've added an app for our citizens to be able to see how much water consumption they've been using. We've got a GSI system to help our citizens understand their own vegetation and the different soils that they're trying to water and keep hydrated, as well as we've been working with Rocky Mountain Power on the pumps that we use within our aquifer and being able to get the water up so we can get it to our citizens. But the biggest thing that I am most proud about is our citizens. We've been able to inform them and educate them on all the different opportunities that we need them to do to step up to help conserve water. I'm happy to say to date, we have over 930 million gallons we've saved.
Preserving the Great Salt Lake, it's been one of my top priorities since my first day in office. And the reason it's been such a top priority is because of the focus that you all have put on it. Speaker Wilson, Governor Cox, many members of the state legislature, Hawks, Ferry, all of you have made this such a big priority. It's easy for our team to put a lot of focus on this. And we've worked diligently and collaboratively with Utah's local officials, other elected leaders to introduce Saline Lake Ecosystems in the Great Basin States Program Act. It's a critically important bill that will establish a scientific monitoring and assessment program, bringing together stakeholders to set a path forward that works for our community's needs as we seek to save the Great Salt Lake.
To complement and elevate the work already being done at the state and local levels and to save this critical resource, I've partnered up with a few of my colleagues, Congressman Chris Stewart, John Curtis, and Burgess Owens, in introducing the Great Salt Lake Recovery Act. Our legislation provides funding for and authorization for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to carry out a program to monitor and assess the water availability and conditions of the saline lakes in the Great Basin, including the Great Salt Lake. It also authorizes a feasibility study on addressing drought conditions in the Great Salt Lake, which may include an identification of any potential technologies capable of redirecting water sources and necessary permitting across state borders.
2 years ago, the state offered a water optimization program which required some new technology to be developed and deployed on the farm. And that was the initial stages of the automation that we have now for surge flood irrigation. Historically, if I look at how we irrigated this field, we could only cover half the field in 1 week. So we've developed the software to be able to build schedules. Now, under a surge irrigation method, we can cover the entire field in 1 week. If you automated the entire Bear River Canal system and you automated all the fields, it's possible to save in the neighborhood of 100,000 acre-feet per year. That's a big number, and when you take that amount of water and put it into the Great Salt Lake system, now you have a significant amount of water that stabilizes the Great Salt Lake without further decline.
The water optimization program has been a great opportunity to be able to make a lot of improvements over a lot of acres. We've been able to implement things that we only dreamed of before. These projects aren't only going to benefit those farmers and ranchers, they are going to benefit all of Utah. And that kind of is exciting to me to know that what I'm doing can make an impact.
HB 242 that was passed last year was a great boost to the entire secondary metering project statewide. It allowed for $250 million of funding to go towards secondary metering, which was a lot of small irrigation companies just really couldn't afford to take that step. We've seen a lot of support from a lot of the customers and customer agencies in providing those secondary meters. So it benefits really conservation as a whole, and it allows people to understand how they actually use water and to be accountable for the water that they do use.
These are huge steps, generational type steps, but everybody knows that that's just the beginning, and we need to do more and more because it's just going to take a real big effort from a lot of people working together. It's hard to think of any long-term solution for Great Salt Lake that doesn't involve water banking. Water banking is an innovation that really allows us to share this precious resource of water. When you think about how a bank works, if you have money that you can get by without, you can put it into the bank, you get paid for it, and somebody else uses it. It's really the same idea when it comes to water. So if somebody can get by without a water right, or they can get by with less water, they can put it into the bank, and then other people can come and lease that water back out of the bank. So it's a great way to take this scarce resource that we have and to spread it out so that more people can use it. I think in the last few years, the real advances have been just testing this proof of concept. So we've put it under the ground. We're actually deploying water banks in different parts of the state. And so we're learning what works and what doesn't work and how we can make the system work even better.
If we make the investment in becoming efficient now, it continues to pay dividends long after we're gone.
It's important to us that we leave what we use and what we live off of better than we found it before. Participating in conservation efforts allows us to know that the better the efforts we provide now, the better benefit it is to our kids.
It's been remarkable to me to see the combination and the power that comes from having the private sector and government working together to solve a complex issue. Everywhere I go, people want to talk about saving the Great Salt Lake and what they can do individually as well as collectively to make a difference in it. We all understand we're linked together on this, and everyone wants to work on it.
What excites me the most is knowing that we now have the entire state working on a solution. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take all of us working together. We need to kind of be creative in our thought process, in our daily actions, and also look at other cities outside of the state and outside of the country on how they've solved the problem we're facing here in the state of Utah with our lake level.
I love the state of Utah. I grew up here. I want my kids to be here and to have the quality of life that we want to have, that I want my kids to have and grandkids to have here in the state of Utah. You know, we need to have that lake. It helps sustain us. And so we need to do our part to protect it.
As you can see, much progress has been made. However, there is still more work to do. Saving the Great Salt Lake will be a marathon, not a sprint. We need everyone to do their part, take the long view, and come to the table with workable and creative solutions to solve this complex and important issue. This will perhaps be the most important cause I will work on during my time in public service. And I remain hopeful and optimistic that together we can ensure the Great Salt Lake is around for generations to come.
Thank you for being here. I believe that if we are smart, if we work together, and if we listen to one another, we can both grow and protect the amazing natural resources of our great state. I'd like to go now, and in that spirit, to turn some time over to Teresa Wilhelmsen, who is our wonderful state engineer, who's going to help us better understand how, quite literally, we get water to the end of the row in Utah. Teresa.
Well, good morning. I'm a little short here. Good morning. It is amazing to see how many people are in the room today. So very grateful. Thank you to Speaker Wilson for asking me to come up here today to explain to you how water moves to the Great Salt Lake. So as state engineer, I'm responsible for the general supervision of Utah's water resources. So it's basically my job to tell Utah's water resources where to go, tell it how to go, where to go, when to go, and how much of it should go. So today I'm going to give you a very high level overview of how Utah's water flows to the Great Salt Lake. And this is a very simplified high level. So as I get started, the This slide was actually shared with me from a retired water attorney that lives in Oasis, Utah. And just wanted to use this as a framework for what I'm going to describe to you today. So everyone in this room sees water, Utah's water resources, every day, one way or another. As state engineer, I see it as a web in my head that we work with every day to make sure that water is getting where it needs to go. And the decisions that I make are based on the foundation of those decisions is Utah's prior appropriation water rights system. So it is a very complex web, and just like a spider web, when you pull one of those strands of a spider web, it moves, right? And it moves together. And that's how I also see our water rights system and how water gets to the lake, of how interconnected it is. So let me go ahead and start describing some of this web to you. I'm going to start with the Bear River system. The headwaters of the Bear begins on the north slope of the Uintas. This is an interstate stream. It starts in Utah, goes to Wyoming, comes back to Utah, goes to Idaho, and then comes back to Utah again, ultimately ending in the Great Salt Lake. This graphic describes some of the large surface sources that flow to the Bear River. You'll see them up there. And the average annual inflow to the Great Salt Lake from the Bear River is estimated to be about 1 million acre feet of water. And let me just pause for just a second. There are two terms that you'll hear a lot when we talk about water. One of them is acre feet. That represents a volume of water. So a lot of our storage reservoirs and these slides that I have are represented in acre feet. You'll also see CFS, and what that stands for is cubic feet per second, or sometimes it's referred to as second feet. That is a flow of water. So you'll see that through these slides as well. So let me go dive a little bit deeper into the Bear River Basin. In this slide, we have a hydrograph of the Bear River at a gauge at Corinne, and it shows a median high flow of over 2,000 second feet in April, and then a medium flow of 189 in August, second feet in August. You can see how all of the systems within Utah really do vary. High flows in the spring, low flows in the later season. So for this system, my office distributes water rights based on the water rights system and the existing rights. And you'll see on this slide that during dry years, diverters, users on that system start taking water around the beginning of May. Wetter years, they start taking it around the end of June. So you can see how the demands on that system work. So now I'm going to step into the Weber River system. This is another major tributary to the Great Salt Lake. The Weber is within Utah. It's not an interstate stream like the Bear River. And on this graphic, we've just depicted two of the large inflows to the Weber. Number 2 on that graph is the Ogden River, which we crossed if you got off I-15 here. And number 3 on there is East Canyon Creek. So there are many tributaries to the Weber, but these are just 2 of the largest. You're also going to note on that map, if you look at number 5 on that map, if you can identify that, that is actually called the Weber-Provo Canal. That moves water from the Weber River over to the Provo River. So there's an interconnection in that web of water resources. Some of the other outflows from the river are large outflows. Number 6 is the Willard Canal, which fills Willard Bay. Number 7 is the Davis Aqueduct, which moves water south into.
That sounds just fine.
So you can see just on this
The video was
system,
having
how
issues,
many
but
inflows and outflows,
this
and
part
even out
sounds
of
good.
basin transfers. There's very
No,
large demand
it
with
sounds
the
really
Weber
good.
Provo. So looking a little closer at the Weber
Yeah,
Basin,
so I could tell what the video was
the
struggling.
average annual inflow to the Great Salt Lake on the Weber It's just over 400,000 acre feet. So about half the size.
I'm not sure what happened, but when the video was over,
inflow.
like
Looking
Wilson
at
was
the
just, it
gauge
was
on the
just
Weaver
white.
near Plain City, the hydrograph shows a median high of over 1,000 second feet and a median low of about
So I'll
60
have to figure
second
out, but
feet,
yeah, it was just like
in August. Much smaller river than you see in the Bear. High water rights, we typically cut high water rights in May during dry years, and they may make it to July in a wetter year. Again, another cycle in the system. So now we're going to look at the Jordan system, the Jordan River system. And this web is much, much larger. A lot of interconnectivity going on here. The main connection, which many of you are most likely familiar with in the center there is Utah Lake, the smaller lake. It's connected to the Great Salt Lake through the Jordan River, and that's how the inflows from the Jordan make it to Farmington Bay. And I'm going to point out some important pieces here. If you look at number 7 on that graph, that is water that's imported from the Colorado River Basin through the Strawberry Aqueduct into the into the Spanish Fork River, which is depicted as number 3. So it's a large trans-basin diversion that imports water over to the Spanish Fork River. The Spanish Fork River then is brought north, if you see number 9, to the Provo River. Then number 10, water is imported from the Provo River from the Colorado River Basin again through the Duchesne Tunnel, which is in the Uintas, if you've seen that. So a couple very large import infrastructure that brings water over from the Colorado River that ultimately ends in the Great Salt Lake. If you look at number 12, that Salt Lake Aqueduct, that moves water from the Provo River to the Salt Lake Valley. And water is used for the various entities in the Salt Lake Valley. Let me talk about just a few details about the Jordan. So the average annual inflow from the Jordan River is about 560,000 acre feet. So it's just slightly more than the Weber River system. Let's see, looking at the gauge, if you know where the Surplus Canal is in the Salt Lake Valley, it's about 17th south and, I guess 5th west, maybe a little more west than that, 7th west. That gauge shows a high median flow of 573 second feet in June and a median flow of 259 second feet in December. Now, this is a much smaller channel, much more controlled, and there are some issues of flooding at times based on flows in this Jordan. So we keep it a little bit more controlled. Typically, rights in the Provo River are on a class system, first class being primary rights, 17 class being the high flow rights. So we cut high flow rates on this system in a dry year, typically in May, that high flow rates are cut off in the Provo River system. In a wet year, they may make it to July on that system. So just very high variability again within this system. And I just want to share kind of just a little analogy to think about. There is a location on the Jordan River. It's called the Turner Dam. And that is where a lot of water is diverted to various canal companies. And I remember being on a tour with some legislative representatives, and we had toured the Provo system, and we were standing at the Turner Dam in the Jordan Narrows, which is near, if you're not familiar with it, it's near where Geneva Rock is. And so we were standing there at the diversion. There was a soccer ball that was hitting up against the head gate, kind of spinning. And the legislative person said to me, oh, someone in Lehigh must have lost that soccer ball. And I said, well, did it come from the Provo? Did it come from the Weber? Did it come from the Strawberry or did it come through the Duchesne Tunnel? Because all of that interconnectivity happens at that location on the Jordan. So let me talk just briefly about a couple other factors that affect water in the that make it to the Great Salt Lake. Water use data is reported to our division. We took a 5-year average to look at the diversions for mineral extraction, and that 5-year average is about 220,000 acre feet of water. Now that's diversion, not depletion. The 10-year average of that import water that maybe brought that soccer ball over is around 134,000 acre feet of water. And just, we wanted to kind of show a comparison of net evaporation. We always get asked about evaporation on these systems. If you look at Bear Lake, we estimate evaporation of about 120,000 acre feet. Utah Lake is about 165,000 acre feet. And the Great Salt Lake is about 2.2 million acre feet. So I'm going to pull together here that web that makes up the water sources and the storage facilities within the Great Salt Lake Basin. And this is going to take just a minute to kind of slide in here to show you first the significant reservoirs on the system. And I'll just summarize as this comes in. So the Bear River system, there's about 1 million acre feet of water to the Great Salt Lake. There's about, of the large reservoirs we've identified, there's about 716 acre feet of water stored on the Bear River system. The Weber, the inflow is an average of just over 400,000 acre feet of water. And the active storage capacity of the larger reservoirs is around 551,000 acre feet. The Provo River average inflow is 560,000 acre feet. And the active storage capacity of the larger reservoirs on the Provo system or on the their tributary of the Jordan are 2.3 million acre feet. Looking at the slide also shows the active storage capacity at the Great Salt Lake at an estimated elevation of 4,200 feet is around 15.5 million acre feet of storage. Currently today, the capacity is estimated at 7.1 million acre feet. So with this slide, you can see just how interconnected, complex, and interdependent the system and all of the sources to the Great Salt Lake, and how essential all of this is to all of us that use water in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And with that, I am a little ahead of time. I'm about 5 minutes ahead of time here. But I just want to end today with saying that I just thank every one of you for being here. I thank Speaker Wilson for inviting us all to come and putting together this program. And I offer to all of you, as state engineer, if you have questions about any of these systems or how we move water or the decisions that we make on a daily basis, please feel free to reach out to me. We're happy to address your questions and answer them and help bring a good understanding to the systems that affect the Great Salt Lake. So with that, I am going to conclude a couple minutes early, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Next, we will hear an overview of Utah water trends and cycles from Brian Steed and William Anderegg.
For the record, that was not the walk-up music we requested. We've been working on this a long time. If we can go back, I'm not touching it, for the record, but it may be possessed. So you're seeing a brief overview from the slide presentation that we're about to give you. My name is Brian Steed. I am the Executive Director of a new institute up at Utah State University called the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air. I'm joined on stage with my colleague from the University of Utah, Dr. William Andrade. You can introduce yourself, please.
Morning, everyone. We're excited to be here. William Andrade, University of Utah, the Wilkes Climate Center.
Awesome. And while we figure out these slides, let's just talk where Teresa ended. First, I just want to say thanks to the state leadership, especially Speaker Wilson, for taking the time and the energy and the interest in something which I consider to be one of the most important things we've got going on in the state. Water is one of those things which is a limited resource. Obviously, it's something we have to take care of. And the Great Salt Lake is indicative of a broader problem that we may have in the state. And we're looking forward to having real solutions towards that. Secondly, want to thank the legislature. In my previous job, this is awesome. I am really not touching it. In fact, I'm going to put it down. Watch this. You're all my witnesses. I'm no longer touching anything. All right, and if we can just maybe if advance the slides one at a time, does that work? Okay, a little awkward, but we can do that. Anyways, what I was saying, the legislature for taking interest in this really important issue and making real changes. I was for the past 3 years working in the position that Joel Ferry is currently in Department of Natural Resources, and the interest and the investment is huge and really unprecedented in the state. And I just wanted to say thanks. So with that, let's talk about long-term cycles and trends. If we can go to the next slide, if that's all right. And if this would animate, there you go. You're starting to see what was from the high water mark back to where we are currently at the low water mark of the lake. I think this really motivates why we're here today. You're seeing this long-term decline. And it's kind of scary when you look at it in graphical form. I want to thank the good people at Google Earth Engine for putting this together for us. When they heard we were doing this conference, they really had an interest in showing what this looked like over time. And I think it's pretty illustrative. Next, we've already done the introductions, but if we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. You can tell by this that Bill is the fun one, and I am not. I'm the stodgy one in the tie, so I got nothing. Both of us are relatively new in our jobs at different centers across the universe or across the state, but both at universities and both at research universities at that. Why this matters is because, listen, some time ago, we were approached by Natalie Gochner, and if I can get the next slide, to talk about how we can potentially put together a Great Salt Lake strike team. This is something the Gardner Institute has done on a variety of issues statewide, and talked to both of us in our individual new roles, Bill at the Wilkes Center and me at this new, the Institute for Land, Water, and Air at Utah State, to try to get together and get our teams together to try to find some real solutions for what we're doing. Specifically for today, we've been asked to look at the trends and cycles, but I'd be totally remiss if I didn't acknowledge the people that have been part of this process from the get-go, especially Natalie Gochner, who's been an awesome facilitator during these processes, as well as helping to put together the slides today. And I wanted to thank the good people at DNR for being part of the process as well, because it's a good thing. Next slide, please. So before we go there, I want to say thanks to all the other collaborators, which was a ton of researchers, and I hope you were able to read their names quickly. Sorry. You know who you are. Thank you. So key insights. Let's talk about what we talked about. First of all, we're at a historical low. I think that we've all come to realize that. Two, as Teresa was pointing out during her presentation, it is an extraordinarily complex system. Three, there are contributing factors to where we are right now, including precipitation and depletions, but they remain relatively constant over time. Despite that, we see stream flow declines while temperatures rise over the contemporary period, really from 1970 till the present. If we're to forecast out where that goes, we would expect this trend to continue. And Bill will get into that in his presentation a little bit. And because of that, and this is, I'm jumping ahead, I know, we have to start thinking about what do we do? So what do we do? And we have to look at human use being the one factor we can control. And that human use is going to be the policy lever that we're going to have to really get a hold of in order to fix the problem. And lastly, just from our brief time together at the strike team, I can tell you that we've come to the strong conclusion that interventions will work. It's not a lost cause, but indeed getting together and getting more water to the lake actually does meaningful impact for the health of the lake. And with that, next slide, and Bill's got these, so good luck.
Brian and I were deciding if we were going to do a dance off at the beginning or the end of this, but we've got our tag team.
I was going to throw it on the beats is what I was going to do.
All right, so I'm quite excited to share a little bit of the background and context as well. Brian really nicely teed it up, and just, thanks for the invitation to be here today. We're really excited about what we've been able to pull together. This is, of course, probably many of you are familiar with this. This is the lake levels of the Great Salt Lake over the past 120 years or so. And we're highlighting in particular this period from 1980 to present as this focal contemporary period. Of course, we went from the contemporary period record high, and now we're at a record low this year, and it's continuing to head downwards. What you can see, of course, though, in addition to this trend, there's this pretty strong negative trend from the early 80s downward, is there are some regular fluctuations about a 13-year cycle. We do still continue to see those, but that's clearly not the main driving force in this, that we're seeing a long-term trend from particularly in the past 40 years or so, that's got to be tightly linked to human water use. Next slide, please. A couple other pieces for context here and background. So let's talk about a little bit of the climate and hydrological processes that do influence lake levels. First, temperatures have been rising since about the 70s. And this matters for water because all else equal, a hotter air can hold more moisture, and it sucks more water out of the soils, plants, and out of lakes. So this evaporation term, as Teresa really nicely highlighted, is big. We lose a lot of water from the Great Salt Lake and from other lakes and reservoirs. Next slide. Precipitation is a really interesting piece of this story. So this is showing you the precipitation over northern Utah for the past 120 years. And what you can see is obviously it's incredibly variable. There's a huge number of bounces and wiggles. And if we look at this contemporary period, but actually it's probably somewhat visually clear, there's not a long-term trend in precipitation, that over the whole 120 years or even this past 40 years, there's not a strong decline, not a statistically detectable decline. That said, there are quite a few, an increasing frequency of these low precipitation years and periods of multiple years, which then means when the wet years come, it's harder to get that water into our lakes and reservoirs because some amount of that water is really soaked up by the landscape following these dry years. Next slide. Okay, so that's the water and some of the water losses. Now let's look at the actual water coming into the Great Salt Lake over time. We're gonna just walk through these briefly for the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan. And what we do see is there's less water making it into the lake over time. This is the Bear River annual stream flow. And you can see this substantial decline over the full period and over this blue contemporary record. The story is pretty similar in the Weber. Can we do the next slide, please? Fairly similar story here. I won't belabor this point. It's a fairly clear pattern. And then next slide at the Jordan. There's not so much of a trend here, and this probably relates quite a bit to, as Teresa was describing, this complex web of water moving around the state and in particular into the Jordan. Next slide. This one's you.
So given that, one of the things we were tasked with to decide, hey, what are we looking at when we see these declining lake levels? How much can we attribute to those natural factors and that variability that we see? Our best guess is when you're looking at this natural variability in terms of that up and down, when you're looking at precipitation, probably contributes pretty substantially from 15 to 23%. And when you're thinking about that, think that for the last 30 years, we've had these long troughs, right? Followed by sometimes wetter years, but those longer troughs that may have impacted the lake levels to that effect. Secondly, as you saw, the climate has been hotter. And as it's been hotter in temperatures, we've seen more evaporation off the lake. And so we see an additional 8 to 11% as explained on that. And lastly, we see a combination of natural and human consumptive use. What we mean by that is if you have a hotter and drier climate, as Bill was explaining, that you're probably going to have more vegetation that'll suck it up. You'll also have loss into the soils. All that being said, though, we can still say with absolute certainty that human consumptive use has an impact on lake levels, and a significant impact at that. And perhaps even more importantly than that is the fact that it is the one policy lever that we're able to pull in order to stabilize lake levels. And so let's talk about that in the next slide. So just over time, we took the contemporary period and looked at, the next slide, please. Human water depletion by type. So Teresa was going on diversions. That's where you divert it off of the stream. These are depletion estimates, depletion being what water is lost to that human use, right? Or through that human use. So if you look over time, really in the contemporary period, you see a relatively stable human water use depletion. I think this is interesting and telling. If we were to take this trend line back further, as you saw those declining river system levels, you would probably see an increasing level in human depletions. But we couldn't go back that far because we just don't have great data on those depletion levels. And so that's something we'll be working on. So what are those things made of? One, we've got agriculture. This shouldn't surprise anybody in the room. Agriculture was the original water developers of the state and continue to be in production. And so when you look at who's using the majority of that water, agriculture. But interestingly to note, it's a relatively stable line, right? So we're not seeing a big increase in agricultural losses. We're seeing that stabilize out. In fact, you might see even a decline over time. Next. Then we have reservoir. As Teresa mentioned, we're going to have evaporation off our reservoirs, whether it's Bear Lake or Utah Lake or any of the other impoundments that we have. And so we're going to have some evaporation off that system. That's our second biggest water loss on or consumptive use on the system. Next slide, please. Next in line is municipal and industrial use. This is the water that we're using in our homes, primarily around landscaping. This is generally outdoor water use. Interestingly, while the trend is relatively flat, you do see a slight increase over time. So we're using more water in that municipal and industrial setting over time. Next slide, please. Next, we have managed wetlands. And this one I want to be very cautious about because we love the wetlands. The wetlands are really important to biology of the state. They're really important to functionality of the lake. But we have a number of these impoundments around, whether it's the Bear River Federal Migratory Bird Refuge, or whether it's duck clubs around the edge of the lake, say on the Jordan River system. These stop water, they provide wetlands for ducks and other waterfowl and other animals. And as a result of that, they create huge biological benefits. But as the climate or as the temperature has increased, you'll also see some water loss on that. And so that's just the nature of it. We still think this is important, but an interesting facet. Next slide, please. And lastly, in terms of the major water users, GSL mineral extraction. And this one also, you see a slight increase over time on how much water is being used for that mineral extractive industry. To highlight that a little bit, let's go to the next slide. And I'm not trying to target per se the mineral industries. I think that what they do is important. But one thing that's really interesting to note on these extractive industries is three things. One, they have the water rights that are at the tail end of the system, which means that as long as there's water in the lake, they probably have right to draw from their water rights. That's different than most other water rights in the system. As Teresa was mentioning, those high water rights are turned off at some point in the system. It's unlikely that these water rights are ever turned off by force of law. Two, the extractive industries also have unused rights where they've been approved for water rights, but they haven't used their full capacity of water rights. And so that's something to watch going over time. And the third thing that I just point out on these extractive industries are that you will have, as we trend into other mineral needs, and I'm thinking specifically lithium, there's going to be a lot more demands on what we can do with this extractive industry. That may require more water. And as a result, if they're at the tail end of the system, it's something that we as a state really ought to be very aware of as we go forward on management of this lake system. Next slide.
So two final facets to share with you all that our team has been grappling with. The first is, what does the future potentially look like? What might the expected trends in temperature and precipitation mean for the lake and the water coming into it? So these are preliminary analyses. These come from these cutting edge global computer models. And in the upper right, you see temperatures rising in a high climate warming scenario. But what I want to focus on actually are these left two graphs. So this is the historical estimates from these models for precipitation, and then we see the future projections over the 21st century. The top one in green is precipitation. And you can see on average, we see slight increases of precipitation over the 21st century. It rises about 13% by the end of the century. But you'll notice the shading around these lines, this you see this dark green line is the average, and that's the black line as well. The shading around these tells us there's actually quite a bit of uncertainty about what future precipitation might look like. It could go up a little bit more than this. It could actually be flat or even slightly go down. Precipitation is really hard to understand what it might look like in coming decades. We have more confidence though about this bottom left graph. So this is the projection of evaporation and evaporative losses of water. What you can see is it rises too. That makes sense given that temperatures are going up, and it rises as much or slightly more than the expected precipitation changes on average. What this tells us is, even though there might be slight increases in precip, those will be probably more than offset by rises in evaporation, which means similar or somewhat less water available for people and the lake in coming decades. That's the take-home message. Okay, next slide. Finally, this is again things that we're actively working on, and we're hoping to provide more detailed estimates in the next several months. But we're trying to think through what are some of the scenarios and how much water might be required to both stop the decline and potentially refill the lake to certain levels. This is certainly a work in progress, and there's a huge menu of options to do this. We've listed some of the pretty common ones that folks are thinking about and exploring a lot more. And how much might each of these levers actually contribute to part of the solution? Next slide. With that, I want to particularly thank the co-conveners of this team, Brian and Natalie and Joel Ferry. I want to thank all the participants who contributed their time and expertise. Huge thanks to Speaker Wilson for putting this on and inviting us to speak. And thank you all for your attention.
And I have one last thing, not to take the last word, but we have one of our researchers that's part of the strike team, Joanna Andrawada. Joanna, raise your hand. A lot of people know you. She's in the process right now of gathering information on a survey. We would invite all of you to participate in it. I know that she wants that. So if you go out here into the hallway, if you look for the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air booth, we've got these, or I've got one up here if you need it as well. Please, I'd invite you to participate on it. And with that, thank you so much. And thank you as much for your attention to what I might call, death by PowerPoint, but it's important information. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now be pleased to hear from Tage Flint, Jamie Barnes, Candice Hassenjäger, Brian Steed, and Bart Forsyth as they discuss the current state of the Great Salt Lake today.
The walk-up music's really for Bart. We got nothing.
I was helping the DJ. Yeah. Well, good morning. Thank you again for being here. It is very impressive to all of us that have been involved in this program to see this many people actually here and interested in this topic. We know that this is reflective of our community, and we know that we're talking about it almost every day now. What is the future of the Great Salt Lake? So I want to just start off by saying a couple of things. One is thank you to Speaker Wilson. I don't know if we all sometimes realize this, but the speaker did not have to take this on, in my estimation. This is kudos to him for taking on a very difficult topic, one that's not going to be solved overnight, one that's hugely complex. As it's just pointed out in the last presentation, this is not an easy fix. But to take it on now, and to take it on with the right methods and with some funding and with some gravitas in terms of the research that you just saw started up now on looking at the lake and how it's performed and what's going to happen in the future is incredibly important to the process to understand the complexity and move forward. So, Speaker, thank you to you for all that you're doing in this regard. We have an excellent panel this morning, probably in spite of the music that they came up to on, and want to introduce them just very quickly. Jamie Barnes is the director here of the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Candace Hassenjager, the director of the Utah Division of Water Resources, known Candace for a very long time. Brian Steed, director of the Utah State Land, Water, and Air Institute. Mr. Steed has just moved from the Wasatch Front to Cache County just in time for winter. So you're going to need a new coat.
I nailed it.
You're going to need a new coat. That's all I can tell you. And right here to my right, Bart Forsyth, the general manager of Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District. Been in that job for a while and been with the district forever. Bart, with whom I worked early on and have some dirt on if you want to see me after the meeting. Okay, we have 4 questions here. If I do my math right, we're going to give each of our panelists 2 or 3 minutes to respond to each one of these questions as we go forward. And so let's just dive right in if it's okay with you. Couple things that are always on water managers' minds in Utah is the population growth that's projected. I think that we've all seen the numbers from Governor's Office of Economic Development and from the Gardner Institute and other places that say that our population is going to double again in the next 4 to 5 decades. Okay, we're 3 million plus now. We're going to be over 6 million just in 40 or 50 years. That next 3 million is going to come much quicker than the last 3 million obviously did. And the question is, they are all going to need some form of municipal water. They're going to need at least indoor water for human health and drinking and processing. And we're going to need some industrial and municipal type water for outdoor applications. Question is, in the light of the Great Salt Lake, how do we manage that growth? And by the way, that growth is going to largely occur right here in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And so how is it we manage that growth and still look out for the needs of the Great Salt Lake? So if that's okay, I'll start with Bart and ask him to take that question on, please.
Thank you, Tage. And I think the short answer to that is adaptation. Let me explain. I think what this question does is it illustrates the competing nature of our of the demands and the water needs of our water supply in moving forward. And that's really being highlighted, of course, by drought conditions that we've seen over the last several years. And so what are those competing needs? And we've already heard about some of these so far this morning. We have our existing uses, and you can throw into that bucket agricultural use, municipal use, and other uses that have been described here this morning, all having impact on the Great Salt Lake. And then we have growth that Tage just mentioned, and growth is projected to be explosive, just like it has been. We're going to see tremendous growth in our state. And then there is our environment, and the environment is really crying out for water right now. And it's being underscored by declining Great Salt Lake. And then finally, we've also heard this morning about our climate, and it's changing before our very eyes. And it's interesting, every year it seems we break new records for temperature, and our atmosphere is getting warmer and thirstier. So with all that being said, how are we going to balance the needs? And from my perspective, that first bucket of water, where we have control, we have human control, that's where we need to be looking at. And I think that's what the answer is. The answer is that we need to look at ways that we can reduce depletion. For every use needs to be looked at. We reduce depletion, and I think that's a path forward. Now, for municipal water users, we can do our part. And I have to ask the question, where does depletion occur? Well, it doesn't necessarily occur in indoor use. We get about 90% through our indoor water use back to the natural system. Depletion occurs in our landscapes. And so it's in that area where we can make some big changes, big differences in the amount we deplete. And I think we can free up water for the environment if we do so.
Great. Thank you, Bart. Candace, thoughts?
Hello. Okay, awesome. So I was recently at a conference in Santa Fe and about the Colorado River, right? Because we know this drought that is impacting the Great Salt Lake Basin is really impacting the whole western states, including the Colorado River Basin. Pat Mulroy, who's the former general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, gave a keynote. And one of the things that she said that stuck with me was the only arrow in our quiver is to reduce demand. And so to Brian's point that he made, it's our only policy lever to pull. And I like to say that we simply just need to use less water, but we know that that's complicated. We know that we built our society around using a certain amount of water. And so there will be some painful steps that we need to take as we make these changes. In using less water, we need to start by changing how we grow today. So how we're currently landscaping needs to be changed. We need to reduce, as Bart mentioned, our depletions in our landscapes. We also need to measure and report our water use in better and more informative ways. That gets to the secondary metering element. $250 million, as was highlighted in the video earlier, was appropriated for metering secondary water systems and reporting that use to the individual. And then the other element I think that we need to look at, and it is tricky, is we need to change how much we're charging for water as well.
Thank you, Candace. Jamie, thoughts on all this growth?
Oh, apparently we're going to pass mics. We only needed one mic for all of us. We didn't know that. So I'll take this from a innovation standpoint, because I think that's what this is really around when you're talking about new industrial and outdoor applications. I think innovation, we've got to start being innovative in our technologies, and we've got to start looking at new ways that we can do things, especially with regard to industry. Brian hit a little bit on this on his previous presentation, but looking at new ways that are moving away from those large consumption and depletion methods, and looking at ways that we can evaporate less, that we can do the same thing that we're doing because it's important, but also just innovating that new technology. And innovation is hard, change is hard, but I mean, we're all sitting in this room today for the same reason, because we want to see the Great Salt Lake benefit. We want to save the Great Salt Lake. So we're up for doing hard things, and we can do that. So I think looking at new ways to do what we're doing and make it better is something that's going to play an important role in this.
Thank you, Brian. Last time I checked, you had a few kids, and odds are they're going to want to stick around. And I think it's important to note that in Utah, especially, that next 3 million folks that are going to live here are going to be majority our own kids and grandkids. And so I think that gives us an added incentive. What are your thoughts about growth in the Great Salt Lake?
Yeah, I think that it's an important question. Two things. One, I think it's appropriate to point out that a lot of our growth is from people that are here and are having children here who want to stay here. But I'd also point out that I don't think that growth is fait accompli. If we don't get the water situation right, I don't think we have the growth patterns that are predicted. And I'm not trying to be a downer on that. I just think that's reality. If we have better quality, if we have a bunch of other things that are going on that make people less likely to live here, I think that we don't have that growth. So I think it's important that we get it right. The other thing I would say is this. I mean, I've been having a long-term conversation on water really for the last 3 years since I was working at the state level. And I wish I had the magic bullet on what we could do. What I will say is we're going to have to do things differently. And one of my friends told me to do this, but I'm not going to do it because I'm just not that bold. But he thought, all your messaging's wrong. All you need to do is just say, use less, and then drop the mic and walk away. And I think that we're going to have to figure out a way to use less.
Thank you. If only it was that easy, right? Great. I think we'll move on to another question now and talk about water conservation, particularly in the suburban and urban areas of the state. I think we all recognize that along the Wasatch Front, that's what we are, is urban and suburban at this point largely, and water savings that we've talked a lot about. Water conservation has been talked about now for the last 2 decades ad nauseum. And one of the most fascinating parts of what I saw in the presentation previous is the relatively flat line of M&I municipal and industrial water use for the last 30 years. And that's remarkable to me because the population didn't flatline during that time. That population was going up rapidly at the same time that our municipal and industrial use was staying relatively flat. What that says is that the citizens have responded to water conservation. They're using much less per capita than they ever did before. And number one, ought to be congratulated for the efforts that are already made. Sometimes water managers or retired water managers now have taken for granted what has been done, but there is substantial water conservation that's been accomplished. But certainly there's more to do. And I'd like to talk about what the next more to do is. Candace, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, thanks. One of the things when I think about how we're going into the future and the challenges that we're facing that I think about a lot is, and I kind of relate it, and I'm an engineer, I'm not a doctor, but I always kind of think about it as first we got to stop the bleeding. So one, we need to really not put any more non-functional turf in, which will be a change for us and would be very difficult because that is a part of our current landscaping. But that really gets to the heart of integrating our land use and water planning. And then we need to go back and then retrofit our existing landscapes. And that's really just a piece of it. You know, the cost of water that I already mentioned, that'll need to be addressed in the coming decades. Public outreach and education is huge because I think the general public and most of us are disconnected to where our water comes from, right? We go in and we turn on the tap and magically there's water there. And that's a big, great thank you to all of our water general managers of the water conservancy districts, our water suppliers, that we have that at such a luxury. But I think our general public really needs to be educated on that because as we're facing, you know, our changing climate, the rising temperatures that Brian and Bill covered, and coupled with our population growth, we need to do things differently.
Thank you, Candace. Thanks for pointing out that you're an engineer. By the way, engineer to legal profession, we're 3-2 up here. That's it. It's arguable who's best at parties, I suppose. But Brian, you want to take on where we go next if we do something else on water conservation?
Defending the legal professions.
Yeah, or that. Either way.
So, I mean, I think that we're going to have to figure out ways that people are more likely to conserve. I mean, I think that people generally are good, and I think that they generally want to do better. That being said, it's expensive right now. And one of the things that it may not only just be too much turf, it's maybe how we're treating that turf, right? We have pretty good research at Utah State to show that it's sometimes we're just way overwatering what you have. And you can have substantial savings, even with the existing landscaping you've got. Just by doing more. We've got different seed blends that Salt Lake City and others have been experimenting with. The Center for Water Efficient Landscaping has been working really hard to get kind of these on the ground solutions. And lastly, I don't think this is going to be solved exclusively by M&I water conservation. I think we're also going to have to start talking about how we have water optimization in a realistic way in agriculture. And listen, I like agriculture. I'm a product of agriculture. My grandfather, you know, raised, and both my grandfathers were from an agricultural background, and that's what they did, and that's kind of who we are as a people. But we're gonna have to figure out a way to produce the food that we need using less water. And I think that the good news is there's pretty good technology out there to do that. that's relatively cost effective to where you can reduce pretty substantially the amount of water you use to produce the same amount of crop. If we can get that out, and I congratulate the state for a $70 million investment this last year on doing just that. Probably not enough. And I'm looking at Jay Olson. He's smiling. No, he's not. Yeah, now he's smiling. Okay. But we probably need to do more than that. So something to consider. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. We heard Scott Paxman on the video earlier talk about water metering, secondary water metering in outdoor applications and how much impact that's going to and already has made. Jordan Valley Water District has been a leader in water conservation from the beginning and messaging and actual applications. Bart, where do we go from here?
Well, from my perspective, there are three primary building blocks to achieving water conservation, effective water conservation: education, incentives, and regulation. Let me talk about those last two. Incentives. Our incentive programs now are up and running, but they're in their infancy. And it turns out that we're getting great participation rates from the community in wanting to make changes in their landscape with this incentive money. We're looking to increase the incentive money. I think that's going to help and also drive up participation. So changing our landscapes, retrofitting, doing more there is one area where we need to go. And then I want to talk about regulation. We've talked a lot about water efficient landscaping ordinances. And it turns out that many municipalities now are adopting these ordinances, which is great, meaning that all new construction, all new development going into place will be water wise. That is essential. And in fact, I will just tell you that based on what we're seeing this morning with our water crisis here in the Great Salt Lake Basin, I don't know why another development goes in that's not water efficient. From here on out, every municipality needs to be looking at their ordinances, and we need to be looking at how to build water efficiency into every new development.
Thanks, Bart. Thank you, Bart. And couldn't agree more, by the way. The one thing that water managers have had to deal with addressed at least over the years is the fact that maybe not everything in water conservation is always good. And when you live on the shores of a terminal lake, I think it's a discussion we ought to have. Jamie, any thoughts about is all conservation good, or should we be careful?
Yeah, I think we need to realize, conservation is a balancing act. So we need to look at what we're conserving and then what we're actually achieving from that. And is it practical? So what does that mean in the context of Great Salt Lake? And I think what that means is if we're conserving that water upstream, is that actually going to make it to Great Salt Lake? And the speaker talked about the legislation that had been passed this year. I think House Bill 33 with in-stream flows sets us up nicely for that. The division, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, other divisions can hold water rights, in-stream flows for beneficial use. And I think that's a start to that, but there's a balance. We've got to make sure that we're doing it right. We've got to make sure that it's practical and that we're ultimately achieving that end result of the Great Salt Lake.
Great, thank you. It's certainly possible that we can conserve water upstream that does not yield something downstream. Bart, thoughts about conservation? Is all conservation good?
Well, it's a good question, and I'll tell you that there's been a lot of discussion about wastewater recycling, and especially in the Great Salt Lake Basin. Does it make sense? And I think it's something that we need. It's an issue that we need to discuss and decide, where we want to go with respect to recycling. Because if you recycle water, it depletes more water, then reduces the amount of water that gets to the Great Salt Lake. I will say though, and that the Central Utah Project water supply brings over import water, and there's a lot of import water in Salt Lake County and in other areas that essentially makes it to the Great Salt Lake. Those contracts providing for the Central Utah Project water require a certain amount of wastewater recycling to be done. In fact, in Salt Lake County, it's 18,000 acre feet. So I think we really need to be careful that we don't circumvent the contracts that are in place where there may be some wastewater recycling that can happen in the Great Salt Lake Basin. On the other hand, I think we also need to be careful not to impair the lake further with increased depletion.
Thank you. Candace, your division's looking at reuse, water side recycling a lot. Thoughts on this issue?
Hello?
Closer, maybe.
Okay, sounds good. Just like Bart mentioned, wastewater reuse is something that we are looking at. And just to make sure everybody knows, it's the practice of treating wastewater plant effluent to an acceptable level, depending on how it's going to be used, and then distributing it to the end users. So it could be used for, on our lawns and gardens, and it could get to the point of direct potable reuse where it's going right back into the drinking system. A little bit of kind of numbers to back this up, based on an analysis that the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council did, that the wastewater discharges in the Great Salt Lake Basin are approximately 200,000 acre feet. So this is about 10% of the average annual flow going to Great Salt Lake. But we know that in our dry years, that accounts for a greater percentage because we're getting less inflows. So I think, to Bart's point, we really need to be careful about how we implement that. And if we do, in some cases it may make sense, some cases it may not. The other kind of element that we need to consider is, as we're getting a growing population and we're all using less water, because that's what we're all going to have to do. We in the engineer world, we call it hardening demand. We're having less flow, less additional, and more going directly to people. And so instead of this last year, I don't know if you guys saw any of the news articles that came out, and we're like, oh, let your lawn go yellow, right? Because that is an ability for us to use less there in a temporary basis, where when we get 3 million more people and we have less water on our landscapes, it'll be harder to cut back because we'll be directly impacting our human use. So it's something that we consider, but it adds to the complexity of when we're looking for solutions for Great Salt Lake.
Great point, Candace. The hardening of demand is very real, and the more urban we become, the more that is an issue. You're exactly right. It's some of the best shock absorbers against drought in the past in this state have been quit using water on your outdoor applications until we get through this drought. The other, and probably the more significant one, is agriculture. Agriculture has been, farmers know better, I think, than most about how to deal with the drought, and they almost instantly start using less. And through crop types, through watering schedules, and a lot of other things, fertilizer, all sorts of things that they can implement to shock absorb that drought and through the next one. That is, if you turn on your tap to brush your teeth, you expect it to come out. That's a hardened demand for sure. Brian, thoughts on this one?
No, I would just add that it's complicated. I think we have to be smart about it. And in reality, I mean, if we were talking about St. George, recycle, reuse all day long. It's very important for that system. Here, if you've got a system where you have about 92% of the water that's in a pipe ends up back into the Great Salt Lake, it may not make as much sense. You may have water losses on recycling. And so I think that we do have to be smart on how we approach it.
Thank you. I always, when I think about recycling, I always think about in an area that Weber Basin delivered water in, the Park City, Snyderville Basin area. I remember the discussions many years ago with folks in Snyderville Basin about recycling their wastewater back into the valley over and over again to become more efficient. Well, nothing scares a reservoir manager more than somebody being really efficient above the reservoir. Because all of a sudden the water's not returning to the stream and therefore not filling the reservoir downstream. If you look at the Great Salt Lake as that reservoir, same principles apply, right? Okay, speaking of agriculture, let's talk about that. It's widely talked about. You saw on the graphics in the previous presentation that the agricultural diversions are still very high in the state by percentage of diversions out of waterways. And there's a lot to talk about on agriculture, and it's not to vilify the farmer because like I talked about in terms of their drought conditioning, Also, their abilities to return water from the farm back into the natural system is significant. And so we need to talk about agriculture. And Brian said it a couple of times how complex the issue is. Well, agriculture is the top of that list in my mind, as to how we make contributions from agriculture water use to the lake. So issues here, panel, production of food and fiber always has to be part of the discussion, right? We all eat, and we all use agricultural projects on a daily basis, and it ought not be discounted. Property rights, the property on which the farms sit, is that and the right of that farmer to have use for that property is something we want to talk about. We just talked about return flows to the natural system. We need to talk about what the farm contributes there. Agricultural efficiency, there's the buzzword of the year, I would think. What does that mean to all of you? And we have some time, so take your time on your responses to this one. And then lastly, when is it we should convert agricultural water over to municipal water? Do we do that out in front of the demand? Do we do it with the demand? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. It's kind of a loaded question. Brian, because you memorized everything I just said. You want to start with that agricultural question?
Gee, thanks, Dave.
Yeah,
That's
sure,
great.
sure.
Well, is the question which is important?
Yeah, it could be a ranking, or it could be how do we address each?
I'll say, first of all, we've got to do all those things. I mean, we have to be aware that this state has been historically very rich in agriculture. I know that we can quibble about what we grow here and how we grow it, but I can tell you there is a long tradition of doing that. And to the property rights point of view, the way we've developed and our legal system has developed this ability for farmers to acquire water rights. Those water rights are something that farmers hold sacred. I tell you from personal experience that when we're talking about canal company changes or whatever else, it was very personal to our family and how we respond to that. And it's fighting words to say, yeah, we're just going to take that, because it's something that people have invested blood, sweat, and tears into. And so that's something that I think that we have to be aware of as a society and be careful. The other thing I would just say as a general rule, agriculture provides a lot of benefits that oftentimes people don't take account for. When I was head of DNR, I can say that agriculture oftentimes provided open space. It provided food for wildlife. It provided a bunch of other stuff that was important to us as a state writ large, and notions that we're just going to go in and buy a farm and dry that out and divert that water someplace else, is not super popular in those local communities because they view that as that local community dying, and B, it really sometimes ends up hurting the landscape because you've taken what was a very managed system, and now you're going to say go back to wild, and that's going to take some process. And oftentimes that process is not put in place on that buy and dry scheme. And so there may be environmental costs to that as well. So again, not to harp on the complexity, but it is complex. So I would say this, I would prefer being straight up that we don't just buy and dry. My strong preference would be, if I'm going to rank this, that we figure out a way for farmers to use less water and are able to stay viable and producing, because I think that provides some benefits for us all. And we're going to have to talk about how that watering happens. We're going to have to talk about probably the crop types that we use. We're going to have to talk about a bunch of stuff that goes down that list, but it's my strong preference that we keep agriculture and production for as long as we can. To that end, we focus pretty strongly on municipal and industrial, even though that's down the chain a little bit. The reason is I have tried for years to take my grass clippings and bale them up and sell them. Nobody wants them, it turns out. So there is a benefit on economics for those crops as well, regardless of what those crops are, and we have to take that into consideration. So I would prefer to take away those less economically beneficial things and focus on those things for as long as we can. And that's going to involve human choices. I wish I had a better answer than that, but I think that we're going to have to choose what we want this state to look like, and we're going to have to choose how or where we go from here.
Thanks for that. It reminds what you said, jogged my memory about some public polling that was done not too many years ago. And this held true in the most urban parts of the state, as in addition to all the others, that Utahns still value agricultural production and lands very highly. There's 3 reasons I remember. One of them is it's our heritage. It's what we started doing when we got here, and everyone who has a family tree that genealogy that dates back only a few generations in Utah has agriculture in it. The next one was I do need to eat, and I have a need for food and fiber. And the third one was this concept of open space that only agriculture right now in the more populated areas is providing largely. And we do value that we almost take a deep breath when our car enters somewhere that is not wall to wall. So I think Utahns still resonate with that. Good points, Brian. Thank you. Candace, thoughts on all of this?
Sure. First off, I love to eat. So it's and I grew up on a small horse farm in Sandy, Utah, and I can tell you the last thing I want to do is ride a hungry horse. So they like to eat as well. But it is it's the tricky part that we got to figure out. I think agriculture is a part of our heritage, as both of you have described. I think we really need to figure out how can we incentivize agriculture producers to use less water, and that they can be resilient in the faces of drought, and that we can benefit as a society from that saved water as well. But that's tricky. It's not easy. And there's a lot of questions that we need to figure out with that. The other thing I would mention is, really in the past, how we have developed is by, a developer will come in, buy up a farm and water rights, and they will develop that area. And so we call that replacement in place. So right there, that previous water that was used on that land, it's somehow being reused for that new community, for that area. But to Brian's point, the buy and dry, where you take it from a farm and pipe it miles away and put it to a new use, really impacts that community and that buy and dry situation. And it's a big concern. And I agree with Brian. I don't think that's the way, but we do need to work through this, because as we know, agricultural water users divert about 75% within the state, and that's diversion, not depletion, but it's a big chunk. So we do need to figure it out.
Again, your story about horses, it reminds me of my father, who I grew up on farms and worked on farms enough to make me want to go to college. Let's put it that way. It's hard work.
Me too.
Honorable but hard work. And but the shallow wells that my dad had on several fields out in West Davis County would fill up within 4 feet of the surface, largely every single year during irrigation season. And the next stop from those farms was the Great Salt Lake. And so we know where that water was, that shallow groundwater prism was generally flowing and going that direction. And as soon as homes were built on those farms, those same exact wells had no water in them. That tells you what kind of return flows and contribution of non-depleted water that was going to the lake from farms. Jamie, thoughts on agriculture?
Yeah, I agree. This is complicated, and I'm a fan of ag, honestly, and selling off, farms and seeing more developed land isn't super appetizing to me. So I think it's one of those things that's a careful balance. We've created these various avenues now to incentivize farmers and help to get water to Great Salt Lake. But I think one of the important things with this is going to be the education and outreach on that, to let farmers know what's available to them and what those incentives are, because the incentives have to go both ways. I mean, we want water to go to Great Salt Lake, and then we also don't want to put them out of the farming business. So how does that work for both people? And that's a tricky balance, but I think we can do it. But I really think that we've got to start taking the time to provide that education and outreach and how we can make that work and be good players all together.
Thank you. I'll go to, yes.
Can I say one last thing about that?
Yes, let me check and see if a second chance is allowed on these questions. Please.
Brian.
Thanks. I'd also say there's some good news here. I mean, I get the sense that sometimes we fall into this pit of despair and we think, so many changes, so many things we have to do. But again, there are actually pretty effective technological solutions on agriculture to where you can create a bunch more efficiencies. We saw one example in the video earlier today on just pulse irrigation, and where that gentleman farms, it's right on the edge of the wetlands of the Great Salt Lake. Pulse irrigation is by far the most efficient they can do there. It's better than a sprinkler system. And just minor changes, we're showing a 30% savings of water on use for the same amount of production. And if you think about that over time, what that 30% savings is, that's substantial. And that's meaningful. And I think it's important to remember that not all is lost. We just have to do things differently.
Thank you. That was worth giving you a second chance for. Nice job. Bart, thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll have to tell you, out of all these topics, this is probably the one that I'm least knowledgeable on. Nonetheless, I know enough to be a little bit dangerous. So let me just say that I kind of echo the comments that I've heard, in that I believe that it's important that the state of Utah support farmers, that we look to have a viable, healthy agricultural industry in the state of Utah. I also believe that buy and dry is a loser strategy. I really do, and we've seen that across the West. I'll tell you that there's some things that are happening. You know, when we talk about return flows, the way farmers generally apply water to land, a lot of times there's a delay in the water getting back to the stream, and there's a benefit to that, and that benefit, I think, needs to be preserved. At the same time, we need to be looking at how we can reduce depletion. But that benefit really is stream flows later in the year, which helps everyone. We talked a little bit about when do we transition potentially from agricultural use to municipal use. And the way it has gone over time is that it really depends on when the farmer wants to sell their land, wants to subdivide. In many cases, as farmers age, their children take over, and the children want to subdivide. And when that happens, that's when water districts such as Jordan Valley Water, we on a voluntary basis will acquire the water for municipal purposes. I will tell you that when that does happen, then there is a perpetual obligation, a municipal obligation, to provide water to those areas that are converted. So it does make sense that at least a portion of that water go to municipal to the municipal needs. And I think also there are strategies that can be put into place that will allow more water to get back to the environment, to the natural system. How can that happen? The way I see this is we move forward, that we're going to have to be looking at, again, these water-wise strategies. When I started at Jordan Valley Water about 38 years ago, our water deliveries were about 67% outdoor use, 33% indoor use. And now it's about 55-45, sometimes 50-50. In fact, in the drought where we've had good water conservation results by our community, we're on a 50-50 basis. As we move forward, I'd like to see it get further, a greater percentage going to indoor use than outdoor use, maybe 70-30. Could we get to 80-20? What happens then is that we're reducing depletion significantly, and that allows us to develop new water in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And if very little water is being depleted of that new water, then more water than has been getting back to the lake gets back to the lake. That's how I see us moving forward. And what we're going to be seeing is more strategies on how to landscape efficiently. And the deal is that we do have strategies now where the landscape looks very nice and it saves a lot of water. You've probably all heard of localscapes. Localscapes is a new concept, fairly new concept that's been designed specifically for Utah. And when we do a conversion from a traditional landscape to a localscape, we're seeing about 50% savings on the landscape, 50 to 67% savings. It's significant. And so we're probably going to have to tighten the screws as we go forward so that we're, again, depleting less water outdoor and getting that a greater contribution through indoor use and back to the natural system.
Thanks for that, Bart. It's a couple thoughts on conservation in general. Brian pointed out in his earlier presentation that there's really, we've all talked today about what we can do in terms of water conservation, what we can do in water use. There's really only one lever to pull here, and some of the things are out of our control. The projected increase in temperatures and the impacts on the lake, the maybe the more severe drought cycles that certainly we're in now, and we'll see in the future. Those kinds of things are all dragging away from anything that we can do. But I think it's well to have the discussion of what we can do. And I agree with Brian in that this is achievable, and because we're working on it, and because Utahns will work on it in our own way, out in advance of a crisis, I think we're well on our way. Summaries, folks. A minute each. Candace, I see your hands up, please.
I just wanted to mention that after this kind of long period of drought and the increasing uncertainty in our water supply, that the conversations and the work that's being done right now is some of the most critical of our time. And we are making a difference, and we can continue to make a difference. I love this saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is today. And that's just what we're doing. And it's ongoing work. And I'm just super grateful to be a part of it with all of you.
Thanks, Candace. Thoughts, Jamie?
Yeah, one point that I didn't bring up that I think is important to realize is connecting those numbers and what they mean to Great Salt Lake. I think, we all talk about savings and we talk about conservation, but what is that realized savings and what are actually those numbers? I mean, we deal with this every day. So we know how many acre feet it takes to bring up Great Salt Lake a foot, or, how many acre feet goes into that. But I think letting the public know what conservation really means on that end and what savings means, it's not savings just through today. We got to be in this for the long haul, folks. Like, we got to keep doing this. It's a lifestyle at this point. So I think connecting those dots to those numbers and what it actually means to raise the level of Great Salt Lake and how much evaporation. I mean, we've seen that number on Teresa's slide. I mean, 2 million on evaporation. That's crazy. So I think just making people realize what those numbers really are is important and what it means. So, and I'll echo Candace, I'm happy to be a part of this. Thank you for letting me be up here, and thanks for allowing us to do what we love every single day. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Brian?
I'll be brief. 2 observations. One, I think that there's tremendous hope, and we have to keep that in mind, because that hope can drive change, and that change can actually make a difference. Secondly, closely related to that, we're all going to be involved in fixing this. This is not a problem of one industry or one group. All of us need to play our part. And to that end, I mean, it's been fun working on this strike team, because we've got not competitors in academic institutions, but certainly we don't always collaborate. be able to get together and find mutually acceptable solutions and findings, that's awesome. And I think that's kind of part and parcel what we got to do as a state. All of us have to work together to find these mutually beneficial solutions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I just like to express my appreciation for being able to be here with all of you and these expert panelists today. And I am optimistic about our future. I think we have a lot of really smart people here, a lot of people who are willing to implement policy and make change that will allow us to move forward, that will provide the water that we need with our existing uses. I hope Mother Nature will increase our budget. we definitely need that to happen. But I also just want to leave you with one element. Our staff recently attended the Water Smart Innovations Conference in Las Vegas. It's the best water conservation conference in the state of Utah each year, or in the country each year. And excuse me, yeah, and so
We don't want them.
yeah. And so, well, AWWA is taking over that now. Yeah. So that being said, the buzzword this year was non-functional turf grass. And everyone's talking about NFT. So that's the new one. And I'm going to leave you with that. I think the state of Utah needs to have a program to move forward with reducing NFT. Thanks.
Thanks, Bart. Our thanks to everyone in the room who's engaged in this effort and for all the expertise that's being applied to it. My personal thanks to the 4 panelists who, as you can tell, are thinking about this every day and have a huge inventory of expertise in this area, and all have staffs that are working with them in the same level. Speaker, thank you again for our opportunity to talk about this important issue and to have a panel such as this. So enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now enjoy a brief break in our program. Please feel free to stretch your legs and visit with our program partners in the lobby to hear about the work their organizations are doing to protect the lake. We will reconvene in 10 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have a fireside chat about the challenges and solutions for the lake with Speaker Wilson, Director Joel Ferry, and Representative Tim Hawks. Please welcome them to the stage now.
Well, I think we're going to pivot into the next section. It's great to see you all again, and I hope that you've learned some things so far this morning and maybe have some additional insights into the Great Salt Lake. And just want to express my appreciation to those that have participated so far. It's been insightful and very helpful. So this is the part of the morning where we're going to kind of have a smorgasbord of different things we're going to talk about. But really the focus of this next section and the point of this is to talk about some big ideas, some of the things we've heard about, some of the things maybe we haven't related to solving the issues of the Great Salt Lake. The idea, and I'm specifically speaking to Director Ferry, is this going to be rapid fire, Joel?
I can be rapid,
so
no problem.
He's actually a great friend and I can give him a hard time about that. But we're going to have a conversation about some of these innovative solutions. So I have thought it's been really interesting to learn a number of things. First of all, when we think about what Brian Steed and Bill Anderegg talked about this morning related to these cycles and trends. And the fact is, we know that there's going to be cycles in the levels of water coming into the state and the levels of the lake. But it is disconcerting to see that with that even considered, the trend is going the wrong direction. The trend is not staying flat. And we've also talked about a number of other ideas that were in particular discussed in this last panel. But as we go into this next section, some of these things we're going to talk about now are a little bit more interesting and fun to discuss maybe and imagine than others. And some of these next topics also seem to draw everyone's attention, including the media's, but they're maybe more complicated, take longer to accomplish. And I hope all of us can think about what we're going to talk about this in the next section. And no pun intended, but some of these may just be pipe dreams. And some of these may be a little bit more realistic, even though they take more planning and are a little bit more meticulous to execute. So let's get started. And we're going to go through a number of different challenges related to the lake and solutions. Let's start with mineral extraction and start with you, Tim. You work in an industry that doesn't actually extract minerals from the lake, but you work shoulder to shoulder actually with those individuals. And let me just back up a little bit too. Representative Hawks, I called him Tim because he's such a great friend, but Representative Hawks has been a great friend to me over his time in the legislature. We're actually sad to see him retire. I don't know if he's sad to retire, but he's been amazingly helpful and really was the lawmaker that was with me a year and a half ago when we started to really lean into this. And in a lot of ways was the inspiration to put this first summit together a year ago. So Representative Hawks, give us your perspective on mineral extraction. We heard what Brian and Bill talked about this morning, but what are your thoughts about that, the challenge that may create for the lake?
Well, thanks, Speaker, and I really appreciate the way that you've engaged on this issue, just in terms of bringing awareness to it. I think Joel and I were talking just this morning. I think us and Representative Snyder were working on Great Salt Lake related issues, but really when you got engaged, it really supercharged and brought so much attention and focus to this issue. So thank you. I think that the mineral industry is a part of the equation, an important part of the equation on Great Salt Lake. A lot of the economic activity that comes off of Great Salt Lake is driven by the mineral industry, over $1 billion worth of economic activity each year. And a lot of the things that we sometimes take for granted really comes out of that lake. We all benefit in really important ways from that mineral extraction, everything from our cell phones and our laptops, medical devices, pop cans of all things, and even the food we eat is sustained by an important mineral fertilizer that's extracted from Great Salt Lake. So it's really key. Now they are, and we saw from the presentation that went before, they're a part of the like other users of water, they use water. And so in that sense, you could say they're part of the problem in terms of water lake levels declining, but they can also be part of the solution. And I think one of the real great dynamics that's existed on Great Salt Lake for a long time, and there's a lot of people that have put effort into this, is really a collaborative, people trying to work together to solve these problems. The mineral companies have been there, they've been engaging with other stakeholders. And so I think they're going to be part of the solutions we look forward.
Do you want to add anything, Joel?
Yeah, I would just say, I kind of echo Tim's comments. They are an important partner in the challenge, but also part of the solution. When you look at the Sovereign Lands Management account, the funding from that account comes from the royalties that the state receives from mineral extraction, from brine shrimp, from other activities on the lake. But a vast majority of that comes, and that's money that the state uses to reinvest back into the lake. This last year, the legislature, Representative Hawks ran the bill to readjust how those funds are used. And that puts millions of dollars direct benefit back into the lake. And so, that can be an important part of the solution. And again, as I like to refer to Brian Steed, wherever he is, as Dr. Doom. So some of the slides were pretty rough, like the challenges that we face are huge. They're difficult solutions. But like was indicated from the panelists and others today, we're in this together, and they can be part of the solution.
So just real quick, and then we'll move on to the next slide, but in the next area. But in terms of the mineral extraction industry, there's questions and talk about maybe some innovative solution that will allow them to do what they do and pull those minerals out of the lake using less water. Is that something that we think is on the horizon, or is that maybe further down the road in terms of possibility in your perspective?
I'm no expert on that. My sense is that that's a little bit further down the line. I mean, really current footprint of those mineral industries is built on the economies, the economics that work with that current system that's based on forced evaporation. So we'd love to see that tech. I think they'd love to see that technology deployed, but it's always a question of cost and benefit.
Let's go on to the next topic and talk about dust mitigation, not dust. But before we get into this, there's a number of elements about the Great Salt Lake that are really important. And one of that is the ecological environment that we see it create for birds, for wildlife, all those things that are really, really critical to not just our state, but really the region. And we think about the loss of the ability of those, even the brine shrimp, to thrive and prosper in the lake. And then you layer on top of that, with a receding and lowering of the lake level, this risk of dust. And what really caught my attention a year and a half ago was this kind of hemispheric event that we may have related to toxic dust with lithium and with titanium and all these hazardous materials that will breathe into our lungs, and to some extent are already being kicked up into the atmosphere. I witnessed a dust storm out on the Great Salt Lake when I was out there a month or two ago, and that dust was literally picking up off the lake bed and heading right to Salt Lake City is where it was headed that day. But our ability to mitigate this toxic dust that exists out there now, and if we continue to expose more lake bed, is one of the biggest risks we face to our region. And I'm curious, and let's start with you, Tim. I mean, how do you think about that? You know a lot about this issue. What do we do in terms of dust mitigation right now and into the future?
Well, this is one of those issues that I think where we all take the lake for granted, right? I grew up in and around Great Salt Lake. I didn't think about Great Salt Lake as protecting our air quality, but that's what's really coming to the fore. And I think the reason it's coming to the fore is when we look around the world and we see the loss of terminal lakes, we see how this script plays out. So it's not just, just here, but we've seen it happen with the Aral Sea. We've seen it happen with Lake Ermia, and then most closest to home, I think, is Owens Lake in California. Much smaller terminal lake, became the single largest source of particulate dust pollution in North America. So we know what happens when these lakes are lost. In terms of, it's interesting when we start talking about mitigating for dust, it's important to recognize that at that point, if we're mitigating for dust, right, we're really at that point looking at almost a post-mortem for a lake that's gone. Because when you look at Owens Lake, that's what they're doing. They're spending all of their time and their energy just trying to keep the dust down. Their ecosystem is largely lost. They're trying to bring back a little bit of that function. But it is a massive challenge to talk about mitigating dust. The most obvious way to mitigate dust is to get more water into that lake. But we also need to be clear-eyed about the challenges. The places that are putting out the most dust currently are the ones that have been driest for the longest period of time. So to get to those places, you need to add not just a foot or two of elevation to the lake, but you've got to add 10 feet or more in some cases to get to those things. So dust mitigation, enormously challenging, enormously expensive. And so it's really one of those problems that we want to avoid. Let me add this too, though. I think sometimes we're starting to hear people that are afraid that I'm breathing toxic air. I need to move. This is really a long-term threat, sort of decadal type threat that we're talking about. So we're optimistic that we can get ahead of it.
Thanks.
And if I can just add to that point, the dust mitigation, the challenge associated with that is truly the cost. So whether it's cost of getting more water to the lake or cost of actual mitigation of that dust itself, you're talking of something in the neighborhood of $30 to $50 billion long term. And so there are, this is really to kind of highlight, I think that we talk about this, is to highlight the potential impact, but the fact that there are so many other options before we get to that point where this is truly, as Tim said, it's kind of a post-mortem. There's a lot of things we can do before we get to that point. And we ought to be taking and making those efforts and doing everything we can today so that we don't get to that point.
Just before we move off of the dust issue, there are two elements that I've discovered over the last year, and maybe this is patently obvious to people, but the first is that the way this exposed lake bed works is it takes a number of years for the lake bed and the way it is exposed for the dust to actually start to emerge. But the longer the lake bed is exposed, the more probable it is that some of these toxic materials will actually start to emerge into the environment. And secondly, just specifically about mitigation and what happened at Owens Lake, it is 1/10 the size of the Great Salt Lake. You talk about the cost director ferry, but I think there's actually a real question in a lot of people's mind, is it even possible to mitigate the dust on a lake the size of the Great Salt Lake? Is it even realistic to do that? So I will just kind of end where we started. I think that the obvious issue here is there's only one solution, and that's to cover the lake with water. So, all right, let's move on. Someone get that door, and then let's move on to talk about something that we've heard a little bit about, which is a pipeline from the Pacific. And this gets a lot of attention. And it's sort of an interesting solution. We were in Israel. One of the ways they solved their water problem there was desalination, that they didn't have to pipe it all the way across 2 or 3 states like we would have to do. Joel?
Yes.
What do you think about this?
So, you referenced pipe dreams, and this might be one of those pipe dreams, but I think it's something that we have to discuss. And it's whether, do we bring, like, what resources are available to us? Again, I've actually had our water resource group look into this just a little bit, spent a little bit of time just to get an estimate, like a rough estimate, what would it cost? And to bring in, if you look at the slides earlier, we're short on a 20-year average, we're short about 400 to 500,000 acre feet of water a year over the last 20 years. If we had that amount of water, the lake would stabilize and actually hold it an elevation that's long-term sustainable and viable and productive. And so that's a lot of water. So what would it cost us to bring in that kind of water from the ocean if it were even feasible? And what you're looking at is a pipe that's in diameter of something around 13 and a half feet that would push about 700 CFS constantly and cost in the neighborhood of 60 to $100 billion. So now that's really expensive again, but what is the cost to do nothing? Or what is the cost if we continue down this road? So again, putting it in perspective, that is another option. Now, there's all sorts of regulatory and environmental, and what do we desalinate the water? Do we so that it's clean and pure, so we're not bringing in foreign contaminants and other things? How do we administer that? Right, those are all huge questions that have to be asked. So today, no one is out there. We're not setting aside money for a budget to start the pipe. So California, don't freak out. We're not coming for your water, your ocean water. But ultimately, what we have to do is look at what alternatives do exist, because I think ultimately that's how important and how dire the situation is. That's how critical this is that we get this right, that we're actually considering some of these, quote unquote pipe dreams and saying, what does that look like? And is it even feasible? And I think part of this discussion, part of the opportunity we have is to look at all options, to say no idea is too crazy, no idea is too big, no idea is too unreasonable. And so there are a lot of ideas out there. It's incredible when the people of Utah are really stepping up. You wouldn't believe the number of emails and the letters and the information that I get in the mail on different ideas on how we're going to save Great Salt Lake and how we're going to get water to Great Salt Lake and different things that we can do. And so this is one of those interesting ideas, very expensive ideas, and an idea ultimately that if we get down to it, there's one of these things that we can do. I mean, part of the question is desal, and can we participate in a program that helps Arizona or California or Nevada so that they don't take so much Colorado River water. We supplant it, we swap it with them so that we can keep some of that water up here, where it originates. And so, those kind of questions and possibilities are certainly out there.
We saw this morning in Teresa Williamson's presentation how interconnected water is just for the Great Salt Lake. When you do that and contemplate an entire region, you just described something, Director Ferry, that I think is important. I do believe desalination is going to have to be part of the solution for the West. And we'll have some federal delegation folks here in a minute. But Arizona has actually already tried to work with California to get water desalinated to Arizona, and California has given them the Heisman. And so this effort for the West is going to take a lot more cooperation and collaboration between states and the federal government, probably helping kind of negotiate that for the country. And and maybe a pipeline isn't that crazy. Maybe the pipeline doesn't come to Utah, but it goes somewhere else to help our water needs. Let's talk about something that is exciting for Director Ferry, something that I really didn't know much about until about 6 months ago, and that is cloud seeding. Director?
Yes. So thank you, Speaker. I do get excited when we talk about some of these topics, and cloud seeding is one of those topics that I get really excited about because of the potential that exists. So cloud seeding is something that the state of Utah has been employing and utilizing since the 1950s. So for the past 70 plus years, and just around the country, different areas use it. We've been developing and utilizing cloud seeding, but we've been doing it on a very small scale. And some of the results that we see from cloud seeding are increases of 5 to 15% increase in yield in a snowstorm.
Explain how cloud seeding works.
Okay, so I'll back up. Cloud seeding.
Simply, Joel, explain simply.
And
briefly.
So for those of you that don't know, I'm a farmer, so I can use farm words. That's my background. I'm not a big fancy professor or anything like that. But basically what we do is you burn a chemical solution that's silver iodide, and that solution is chemically charged so that the water molecules in the atmosphere want to bind to it. So the little particle of silver iodide will pull the water molecule out of the air. It'll make it heavy, and then it falls. And when you do it in the wintertime is when it's most effective, because the temperatures below -5 degrees up in the upper atmosphere, that's when you have the most effectiveness of this. And so the studies have shown that this really boosts your snowpack. Now, the reason that this is so effective is that the silver iodide is one of those inert, naturally occurring. It doesn't cause any sort of damage or anything to the environment or to humans. It's just naturally occurring, and it's such small amounts, it's untraceable, it's unnoticeable. But the results and the impact are huge. So when a typical storm system comes across, usually you have about an 8% water yield out of a storm. So if 100% of the water that's in the clouds, 8% falls out in the form of precipitation. So if we can boost that from 8% to 9%, that's a 10% increase in the actual moisture coming out of the cloud. It's just a small amount, but if you can increase your overall annual snowpack from 100 inches to 110, or 400 inches to 440, whatever that number is, different areas of the state, you're talking about significant increase in the runoff, because when the runoff occurs, the ground's already saturated, and it's kind of like the cream on the top, right? It's a benefit on top of everything else. And right now we're implementing this, and the state, through the Department of, or the Division of Water Resources, the state funds about $350,000. And that does a program, and the estimates coming out of our Water Resource Department says that boosts our statewide water yield by about 100 to 150,000 acre feet. Okay, so it's significant for $350,000. The water districts and local water cities and water jurisdictions will match that. So statewide, we're normally putting out $700,000 to $800,000. And so what we're looking at doing is, what would it take to maximize that statewide, regardless of what watershed it's in, regardless of where in the state you are, and how can we do that? And so there's things like, there's areas of the state where it would be much more effective if we had planes that were flying the clouds to do this, or if we had remote stations. So right now we have just manually operated stations throughout the state. You have, like on a farm, that's the typical operation. A farmer will have, it looks like a little teeny generator. And they're called generators. And he goes and turns it on when a storm's coming. He'll get a text, hey, turn on your generator. He goes out, turns it on, it burns some propane, and it burns the solution. But sometimes we have inversion. Sometimes the storms aren't right where the generator is. And so by full deployment, if we can put these out in different parts of the state, and we can maximize by making an investment of a couple $1 million a year, one-time investment to kind of build and get the infrastructure set, of about $3 million, we're talking about making a huge difference in actually increasing wet water that falls out of our skies and boosts our snowpack and gets down to our reservoirs, our rivers, and ultimately to Great Salt Lake. And this is one of the things, like when we talk about levers that we can pull, right? They talk about conservation, and conservation is the biggest and best lever that we can pull. But this is one of those levers that we can pull to actually increase yield in a way that will be meaningful and will make a difference. So some state investment, additional investment from our local water districts, we can really ultimately make a huge difference to the amount of water that's getting down to Great Salt Lake.
Thanks. I think we all got a crash course in cloud seeding. Maybe some of you know about it, but it's pretty interesting.
And if you have any questions, you know, don't believe everything you read on the internet. You know, go to reputable sources to learn about cloud seeding. But I think we'll see more education and more information out there to help all of us understand a little bit more about what cloud seeding really is and what it does.
Oh, it's good to have that as an arrow in our quiver. And if you do want to know more, just think long and hard before you ask him, because you're going to be about 45 minutes into that conversation. So
at least.
All right, let's move on. So lingo in this space, M&I, that stands for municipal and industrial water use. Tim, walk us through what's been done, what you see maybe comes next. And just because I hear about it a lot, give us your perspective on HOAs and that element if you want. And that's a curveball that you weren't expecting.
So I'll start with HOAs. They're basically evil. No, just sometimes evil. We were just discussing, as a matter of fact, an HOA that was fining people for installing artificial turf. Now, HOAs are tricky because that's all done by contract, right? But I do think it's massively problematic, and I've heard from them. I've heard from people saying, you know, look, I went out, I invested in Xeriscape, I wanted to do something good for the environment, and now they're being threatened with fines and all other things for simply trying to do the right thing. So we would hope that our HOA friends out there will be reasonable and flexible when it comes to encouraging people to save this very, very precious resource for all of us. So, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that I hear the most common, and I think it's one of the most destructive ideas out there, is why should I do anything to save water when agriculture uses all the water? And that's effective. We hear that. I hear that all the time as resistance to doing something. And I think embedded in that is a poor recognition that ag is doing a lot. That ag is cut back in many cases 40 to 70%. We're investing heavily in ag optimization, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the amount that people put on their use in their homes and in their yards is very significant. It's hundreds of thousands of acre feet. If you think about some of the things, the specific things that we've done to try to encourage people to conserve, the single biggest thing we've done is invest in secondary metering. And I know that sounds so wonkish and geeky, but most people in the state don't realize this, but people up here in northern Utah do. Is there's two sets of pipes that come into your house. You've got your treated drinking water that comes in, and then you have those old irrigation shares that were just converted to secondary water, untreated water. If you grew up around here, your mom was always telling you, don't drink the Weber water, right? And it was because it was untreated water right out of the river. We drank it anyway, and probably stronger for it. We drank it right out of the gutters, as a matter of fact. But
I'm starting to understand you a little bit
better.
better.
That probably explains a lot. But one of the things, and one of the most powerful ideas I think that it's out there, is simply by telling people how much they use. So me and my neighbor were on unmetered secondary. I use, hypothetically, I just use just a gallon of water, and my neighbor uses 10 million gallons. We pay the same flat fee. 75, in my case, it's about $75 an irrigation season, no matter how much we use. So I know people that are growing cattails in their yard, right? I think some of the studies, Tage's neck of the woods, when they did some of this, some of these people are putting 300 inches of water on their yards. So that's more than the wettest Amazon. You could grow rice with that, right? That's the kind of water that people are putting on the yards. Interestingly enough, though, when you measure it without changing pricing, which everybody says, we've got to change price. But without changing pricing, simply giving people the information about how much they're using relative to their neighbors, you see these massive savings, 30 to 40%, and those savings endure. So I think that's such a powerful idea. Just give people information and they respond. So the state's invested $250 million to try to incentivize people to get those secondary meters in.
Full implementation, that's probably 60 to 70,000 acre feet of water saved a year. We've got people looking at trying to encourage cities not to be draconian. In other words, there was a bill that was passed just this last session that says cities, you can't require people to keep your park strip in turf, right? And then we're also looking at incentive programs to encourage people to do the right thing. How can we make it financially feasible to install more xeriscape, to use less water? And let me just reiterate this point. When people ask me, what can I do for Great Salt Lake? The single biggest thing you can do is to use less water outdoors. Cut back on one of those waterings a week on your yard, or more if you can, and just use less, and use less grass. I tell people too, it's not the grass we use that's the problem, it's all the grass that we don't use. It's just ornamental, just looks pretty. And we also need just a kind of a total mindset shift change, which is I graduated from high school in Maryland. If it's August, your lawn is brown, because there is no secondary metering, no supplemental water at all. But yet here in Utah, in this amazing desert state, everybody expects their grass to stay green through that whole season. And we just need a cultural shift where we use less grass and we're okay if it goes brown.
Yeah, I do. I think an important part when we talk about municipal and industrial is, as Tim mentioned, that culture. Speaker, you and I had the opportunity to go over to Israel, as you mentioned. And in Israel, it's so interesting, the culture over there. I want to give kind of an anecdote. So here in America, when we talk about water, we have a nursery rhyme that says, rain, rain, go away, come again another day, right? So we're telling the rain to get out of here. We don't want you. In Israel, they have a nursery rhyme that goes along. It's kind of a Yiddish, so the translations doesn't rhyme, but it basically says, it's raining, clap your hands and dance. We're going to celebrate. So they are a water loving and respecting culture. We live in a desert that's drier than most of Israel. We need to respect the water that we have. And as Tim mentioned, that means that what can we do as people? That means we can take action and we can make a difference as individuals. We can water a little bit less, our outdoor watering. We can try to focus on changing our habits and our consumption habits to focus on those areas that are really water wise. The toilets that we buy, the faucets that we buy, the sinks, the other things that we do inside of our homes make a huge, huge difference. And it all adds up. There's no silver bullet to this problem of water conservation. But if each one of us just does a little bit, when you talk about the almost 3.5 million people that live here in Utah, when every single one of us does just a little bit, it adds up to a huge amount. And when we look at the growth that's occurring, it's absolutely incredible. We're in a really tricky spot. So we're in this together. We've got to do this together. So.
Just before we move off of this, in the video we saw this morning, we had Mayor Petro from Layton. I don't know if Joy is here. She probably is somewhere. There she is. Great job on the video, by the way, Joy. But I asked to have Layton City put in the video with Mayor Petro. And I'm sure there are a lot of other cities around the state that are doing this, but Layton is one of the leaders in terms of requiring and expecting all new development to be very water efficient. And it's being done, it's being deployed across the city. And one of the things we really have to do is we have to get local government across the state following the lead of Layton and others that are doing this, because that single-handed change in terms of new development, Candace talked about it, will save more water prospectively than almost anything we do. And literally, that is completely in the hands of local city leaders. And so I would just, all of you that are connected to them or that are them, band together and try to figure this out. And what's great about it is those landscapes can look great and they can have turf. And they do have turf, but it's the functional turf that we've been talking about. All right, we spent a lot of time already talking about agriculture optimization in the last section, so we probably don't need to hit on this too much. But Joel, as a farmer that farms on the Bear, I've been to your place. Tell us what your perspective on this as a farmer and the director of natural resources, because these are your people.
These are, and let me tell you, across the state, it's been mentioned, farmers are doing their part. They're engaged, they're involved, and they are taking significant action to reduce the demand for water that they have. And the thing that's so amazing about the optimization program is it enables a farmer to continue to farm the acres that he's farming now, just using less water. And so it's an incredible program. There's huge demand. I'll tell you, the optimization program last year, the state put $70 million into it. And they've had 2 rounds of funding. And essentially the fund will be fully utilized. The demand is there. It's absolutely incredible when you look at the cost share component of the fund as well. You're talking about a 4-to-1 match. So every dollar the state has put in, there's an additional $3 to $4 of federal and private money to make these projects possible. So the $70 million is really like a $350 million investment. The need is closer to $5-6 billion. And ultimately, this, I think, is the single, well, agriculture uses the most water. So it's the single most important thing that we can do is to continue to invest in agriculture water optimization. And I think, you know, in my mind, I think it's imperative that the state make these types of investments, and it will move the needle big time long term.
Do you expect there's going to be a request for more money for ag optimization from the state?
I do.
That's what I thought.
And it's a request that's coming from the Department of Ag. So but personally, just as Joel, I think that it should be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the need, easily.
Well, it's probably one of the things we're spending money on actively that's having the biggest return in terms of gallons saved or acre feet saved. So
the results are amazing, and it's the most effective and efficient way that we can invest to actually reduce the demand for water.
I just want to underscore one point that you already made, but I did not know how the agriculture community in the state would respond to this. I thought there was a chance that, because it's a disruption to them, it costs them money as well. They don't have to do it. There's nothing that we're doing to compel them, but remarkably, they understand the situation we're in, and as you described, they are moving into it quickly, and they're being great partners. And I just hope that we can all evangelize across the state how important ag is, but how great they're being. And because I hear a lot of what Tim talked about earlier about ag is the enemy, and that's absolutely not the case. They're arguably the best partner we have right now in terms of solving this problem, but there's a long way to go. So
I just say one quick thing too. This is a long-term solution, and part of the solution is getting to free market principles, which is changing a policy to help recognize those savings for agriculture.
All right, let's talk about leasing water rights. Tim, you ran a piece of legislation this last session. Just super quick, 30-second kind of overview of what this means, and then what do you see us doing in the future with this?
Yeah, and this dovetails really nicely with this discussion of agricultural water. I think the temptation in looking at water scarcity is to view it as a zero-sum game. So if the lake needs water, we got to go out and find it. Where are we going to find it? We're going to find it with ag, right? And so there have been strategies tried in other systems. Buy and dry was the term that was used, where you basically buy up the farms, strip off the water, and then try to use it for something. Those programs tend to fail spectacularly because they're so disruptive of rural communities, and they don't get rural or local buy-in. Leasing is simply the idea that we're going to acquire water on a temporary basis. So for example, if we're in a drought year, for wet cycle, everybody uses water, they normally do, but in a dry year, I might be able to go to a farmer and say, hey, listen, instead of taking your third cutting of alfalfa, could you lease that water into a water bank, and we'll pay you the economic value of that crop. And if one farmer does that, it's just a drop in the bucket. But if a bunch of them do, and we have a water bank set up, then suddenly we can do something that generates a significant block of water for the lake and keeps the economic value in those rural communities and sustains ag over time. It's a sophisticated way to share this scarce resource, to get beyond the zero-sum game and to just continue to share it. So, Mr. Speaker, you ran the bill to set up a trust last session, put $40 million in that trust. And the big thrust of that trust is going to be to go out and not just try to buy up water rights, which will drive up the cost of water and have other unintended consequences, but to set up these water banks, to lease water from water users when they don't need it, or if they can get by with a little less,
Again, that creative problem solving, that sharing of this precious resource is 100% going to be a really important part of any long-term solution.
Great. Let's move on. I'm going to do something now that I was going to do after lunch, but a couple of weeks ago, I had a great meeting in my office down at the Capitol with, they're affectionately known as the 4 water buffaloes, but the directors of the 4 major water districts in the state. And my question for them was this: Great Salt Lake, lowest in recorded history right now today, and it was then when we met. We've got some real challenges. So salinity levels in parts of the lake are getting to a point that they're so high that we may see some significant challenges to the ecosystem out there. And the list goes on and on, not the least of which is more exposed lake bed than we had a year ago. Long story short, I asked them if they could help us out and send some water down to the lake. And between the Weber and the Jordan Conservancy districts, they've agreed over the next few months to send an additional 30,000 acre feet to the Great Salt Lake. So thank you. And that's water that, you know, their job is actually to keep in their reservoirs. I mean, that's what they're supposed to be doing with it. But they're going to send that water down and help the lake. And we'll continue to explore ways that we can work with them to make more of that happen. But let's talk about ongoing downstream efforts and sort of how the solutions related to our downstream efforts can help with our water issues in the lake. So let's go to Tim for that.
Well, I just want to add the thank you really for the Conservancy District stepping up to do something like that. Most of us that spend a lot of time on the lake, I mean, I've been really concerned about lake levels for years. To see those lake levels decline, we think about what that means over the long term. That's what keeps me up at night. The thing that's really started to keep me up at night recently is salinity, because I don't think anybody thought that salinity levels would rise as far and as fast as they have. And fortunately, the state stepped up and did an adaptive management solution between the north and south arms that should help stabilize it over time. But I just want to underscore what the speaker said. We are very close to some critical thresholds, tipping points on that ecosystem. And if we lose the ecosystem, I'm talking about the ecosystem of Gilbert Bay. So I'm talking about brine shrimp, brine flies, and the birds that rely on them. But the consequences of losing that ecosystem are very serious. They're serious in terms of state control over our water resources because of the risk of Endangered Species Act listing and other things. And so we have some beautiful policy solutions that are going to take some time to implement. And what we really need right now is an all hands on deck approach where everybody steps up, tries to do whatever they can to get water into the lake, not next year, like now. Because if we can't get it in now, then we can't stabilize salinity. And then we start to be talking about the kind of ecosystem loss that we're seeing in other terminal lakes around the world. And then we're just really doing that post-mortem in a sense and trying to mitigate for some of the other harms and implications. So Water Conservancy District stepping up and sending additional water down is huge, right? And we need to find, again, we don't have the legal mechanisms to do this, to move those blocks of water. And so we just need water users stepping up and trying to act as soon as possible to try to, because we need water, quite frankly, before the next summer cycle of evaporation starts, because that's when we're going to potentially just push over some of these really critical thresholds. So thanks again for the Water Conservancy Districts taking that leadership role in doing that. It means a great deal, even in a huge system like Great Salt Lake.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Last thing on the list for the two of you is kind of a transition piece between you and our next panel with some of our federal partners and federal delegation. But Joel, give us your perspective of Utah's Director of Natural Resources on federal involvement, federal funding, and how that impacts your world and our water issues in the state.
So thank you, Speaker. This is actually a really important topic and one that's pressing today, right now, because of the dire situation that we find ourselves in. And with that, there is actually some opportunity. The federal partnership that I think that can exist is one that is that light touch. Utah, we here in the state of Utah, we know Great Salt Lake. We understand its functionality. We understand its needs. When we look at some of the legislation that has been proposed by Representative Moore, Senator Romney to do some additional studies, very, very helpful, provide additional funding to help us resolve some of these issues. Today, we have an opportunity with the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the infrastructure legislation that was passed. There's funding specifically available to help offset and mitigate the impacts of drought. And so we have programs. I like to say we have a toolbox that's full of really sharp tools. The last couple legislative sessions, we passed legislation that was literally a game changer. So we have tools in place now. What we need to do is implement those tools, use them. And to use them, some of that stuff is going to take a lot of funding. It's going to take a lot of resources to be able to use them. So we have conservation plans. We have the Ag Water Optimization Program. That's a long-term investment in conservation. Our turf buyback program fits exactly with some of these federal programs. So really, I think the assistance from the federal government is, there's grant money available, or there's opportunity available, money available. We need that funding to come to the state of Utah to help us offset these drought impacts. And that, I think, is the best way that they can help us.
Great. Want to add anything, Tim? Final words?
Just briefly, I see Senator Lee over there waiting in the wings. And so I would just make the point that there is constructive federal engagement and there is destructive federal engagement. And one of the things I really hope is that we can use some of these partnerships to get ahead of this issue, as we're doing, to avoid the sort of destructive federal engagement that we can see with endangered species listings and things like that. And so I love that our delegation has really stepped up to try to support and partner with the state in solving this really challenging problem.
Right. Well, thank you both for your work on the Great Salt Lake and water. And it's good to have you in your new role, Director Ferry and Representative Hawks. Thanks for all you've done. So.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now be pleased to hear a panel discussion from the current federal efforts to protect the Great Salt Lake with Senator Mike Lee, Senator John Barrasso, and Congressman Blake Moore. Please welcome them to the stage now.
Thanks for doing this. Thank you for being here, Senator. Thank you. Just have a seat. Hey, Congress, lose my mic. Congressman Moore asked where I wanted him. I just tell you this, I don't want to stand next to Congressman Moore, but I'll sit next to you. So he's so tall. Senator Lee, Senator Barrasso, thank you so much for being here. We got the good news earlier this week that you had some availability to join us today, and it means a great deal to me and I think everyone in this room to have our federal delegation represented in this important topic and this important day. So I'm going to let Senator Lee introduce his guest in a minute, but then we'll get into the questions. But let me just, for those of you that don't know, which I don't know who wouldn't know this, but Congressman Moore represents the 1st Congressional District, represents the area we're in here, and as an Ogden native, he's back home today in his hometown. Also represents, I think your district covers most, if not all, of the Great Salt Lake, doesn't it? Just say yes. So yeah, I think it does. So we got Congressman Stewart have a little bit. No, that's probably good. It's for him. Senator Lee has been serving the great state of Utah back in DC since 2011 as a great friend, and we're glad to have him here. He's busy, as you know, this time of year. To take time out of his schedule to be here is very meaningful. Senator, why don't you introduce the gentleman to your left?
Happy to do so. I want to brag on my friend and colleague, Senator John Barrasso, who joins us today from the great state of Wyoming. Senator Barrasso and I have served for the last 12 years together on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate. He's currently our highest ranking Republican on the committee. And if, knock on wood, when Republicans retake the majority, he would become the chairman of that committee. He's a longstanding friend of the environment, of energy production, of American independence, and someone who I learn an enormous amount of information from. You know, we have these very long hearings with lots of witnesses. Dr. Barrasso, who prior to becoming a U.S. Senator was an orthopedic surgeon. He prepares for every hearing so thoroughly. And I learned something. I often learn as much from him as I do our witnesses in each hearing. So Senator Barrasso, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thank all of you for your leadership and for focusing on this. It's really great to work with Mike on the Energy Committee. He sits right next to me. We go to these hearings together, and he is so knowledgeable because it's energy and natural resources, and water is a huge part of this. The people really know him around the country because of his role on the Judiciary Committee. The questioning that he does of witnesses is astonishing. I mean, it really is. It become YouTube moments. At one time, he was trending on YouTube. He was trending. He passed 2 of the Kardashians with his questioning. That's an ability that not many people have. We're happy to talk about all these issues, but I think what we heard from both Tim and Joel in terms of a federal role is a light touch to not be destructive and do more harm than good. I was in the Wyoming State Legislature for 5 years before becoming a U.S. Senator. We had this guy who was in agriculture. He oversaw our water issues in Wyoming as well, Jerry Geis, and he always said whenever you talked about federal money, there were strings attached, and he just said it's either blackmail or bribery, and look out. So we're here to say we're looking for solutions that matter, that will work at a time of record drought and what's happening with the Great Salt Lake, looking for answers there. And Mike and I will assure you that if I'm chairman of the committee, we're going to have the sort of hearings that we would need and get the kind of information and look for reasonable solutions that, and I think your bill, Mr. Speaker, that you came, you wanted to, preservation and rescue were the 2 words that you used. And you know, we want to be able to monitor what's going on, prepare for what's coming, mitigate the issues, but really it is about preservation and rescuing. So I'm privileged to be here, and I sat for probably about 8 years next to Orrin Hatch at the leadership committee, at our leadership hearings and meetings in the Senate, and he would, you know, I'd go into the floor of the Senate and tear into somebody. He said, "John, you should be there to engage, not enrage." And sometimes he said, "You should be there to inform, not inflame." And he said, "You should persuade, not provoke." And if we want solutions here on this critical issue, we need to do it by engaging, by informing, and by persuading. And that's the role that I think we all want to play in our efforts to find solutions to help all of us.
Great. Thank you, Senator. Thank you for being here, all 3 of you. I think you've probably seen as you've been watching and listening that everyone in this room is very resolute in but very deliberately controlling our own future on this and doing what needs to be done. And there's been some heavy lifts done. We know there's a lot more that needs to be done. But let me start by asking you a question. Congressman Moore has been working closely with us and informing us of the work that he's done. And we've got a couple pieces of legislation. He's the sponsor of one of them that as an athlete, this is probably driving you nuts, Blake, but hasn't crossed the finish line yet. And I'd just be curious what all of your perspective is on what we can do to kind of get some of this finished and across the finish line. And whoever wants to take that one can. So.
One of the first things that we've got to do, I appreciate my friend Tim Hawks. Tim and I have been friends for the last 25 years. He and I worked at the same law firm together a quarter century ago. We were only 12 at the time we entered the practice of law. He mentioned something important, which is the difference between destructive and constructive federal intervention. When we look at the federal government's role in this, we have to remember what we can and cannot do. Now, I'm not talking here about Article 1, Section 8 or what Congress is authorized constitutionally to do. We physically cannot, as a government, create rain. Can't do that. Nor should we ever be in the position of reallocating a state's water rights within the state. That is one of the last bastions of state sovereignty. We manage our water in the state of Utah, the way we allocate water rights, water usage. Typically, that's a state thing, not a federal thing. And we want to keep the federal government out of it. One of the best gifts that we can give you is to make sure that that happens from within Utah and not from the United States. There are some key roles that we can play, including facilitating rather than obstructing progress regarding the construction and development of effective water storage infrastructure projects. There are a number of grants that are available through this for the federal government. There are also myriad ways in which we can be helpful in streamlining the process by which those things are permitted. It's one of the reasons why I've been working on legislation for several years, legislation that I've introduced called the Unshackle Act. The Unshackle Act has as its principal purpose the streamlining of the NEPA review process. You know, when you look back at the massive water storage infrastructure projects that were completed in the last century, particularly the early half of the last century, a lot of those went from design concept to steel and concrete in the ground to completion in like a year or two. Today, we would be lucky to get one of those done in a decade or two, if we were even that fortunate to get it finished. But here's what we've discovered. We've learned that our peer nations that have a comparable commitment to environmental security that we do, have all emulated NEPA. They've done it in a way that, unlike our system, has a finite end to it. It puts shot clocks around the process. And what we've discovered is those countries don't see any inferior environmental product at the end of it. There's no environmental loss resulting from the fact that you expedite it. So the Unshackle Act and a number of other reform proposals that we've got, even though they may seem attenuated from the Great Salt Lake at first, it's exactly the sort of thing we need. The more water storage infrastructure that we can get built and in the ground and permitted quickly, the better equipped we're going to be to make sure that this terminus lake continues to get water. Because otherwise, our rising population, coupled with decreased precipitation, is going to create this more of the same vicious cycle, and we can't have that.
Well, and it does look like the Water Resource Development Act that we all worked on, came to the Environment and Public Works Committee. It seems like that was added yesterday in the pro forma session to the National Defense Authorization Act. And one of the things that we do in the Wyoming legislature, single topic, single bill. To your question, when are you going to get this all done? Near the end of the year, people put all things back in sometimes into a larger piece of legislation. But the good news is that occasionally it works well. We think it's going to do that, and water storage is a big part of that Water Resource Development Act.
That's great.
I'll add, you're exactly right. This has been one of the most motivating things for our team to be able to work on the Great Basins, the Saline Lakes Act, the Saline Lake Bill. We call it the Great Salt Lake Bill, the Saline Lake Ecosystem and the Great Basin Program Act. It's been one of the, I've loved it because, and every time I'm interviewed about it, every time I talk about it, I get to talk about the work that you all are doing, the emphasis that you've put on at the state level, and what from our state legislature, our governor, and to the myriad of amazing organizations that have driven this. And at the same time that it's been so motivating, it's been the reason my hair, I think, got a lot grayer in my first term so quickly, is because it's like, we had this bill, it went through all the markup process. It went through natural resources, passed unanimous out of our committee. And then it just takes forever to get things going. And then the political juggernauts get going, and how do you move different things? And I'm working with my counterparts on the other side of the aisle, and we were able to get this particular bill through the House of Representatives at the end of July. And Senate's going to have some of their same drama and everything that they have to go through. But this bill has been led by an effort that, it's not, Blake Moore's team. It's been, we've been the avenue, but the Audubon Society, U.S. Geological Survey has been extremely helpful in getting it to this point. In addition to obviously the work that you all and Governor Cox have been promoting with this. The industry, Ski Utah, I mean, everybody has come together. And that's the thing that I'm really encouraged with it, is that broad support that it has. The federal role and the key piece for this, I really appreciate your comments about your framework that you're using, especially the informed piece, because that's what this particular bill is trying to do, is help inform a lot of these decisions that need to be made at the state level. And I think there's a significant amount of stakeholder interest from across the entire the Western United States. We have fewer representatives out west than we do. Sometimes it's tough to really highlight the importance of this, but this bill prioritizes 8 particular lakes. across 4 or 5 major states back here. And so that's why there's such a role here for the federal government to be able to come in and provide this U.S. geological study to really highlight what is the best path forward, because we know that good, decision-making state legislators, particularly like ours, can go and implement this stuff. And so we're thrilled to get it to where we are. And as the waning months of crazy first term, things play out in the Senate the way they'll get played out, we'll monitor it closely from our end, and hopefully we can see this effort that's been taken on get to that finish line.
Right. What I heard was the end of the year. That's what I heard, right? So let me
What
press
you
you a
also
little bit.
heard is we're much better off if we have not Speaker Pelosi and not Chairman, not Schumer, but you have Barrasso as the chairman of the Energy Committee, and you have a Speaker of the House as a Republican who focuses and understands the Rocky Mountain West, because the folks running the show right now don't, and they don't care.
Yeah. So let me ask you, let me build on a question. Yeah, thank you, Senator. You didn't know it, but you teed up a question for me that I wanted to ask you. Utah is, the congressman just said, we're a small state, and it's been a little disillusioning to see what happened with the latest infrastructure package. There was a lot of money in that bill related to water development, water infrastructure, and a significantly disproportionate amount of that went to California. And the other Western states were just kind of left literally high and dry. How do we fix that in terms of DC and the role that you do? And I'm not, by the way, I'm not putting that at any of your feet. You're probably as frustrated as I am. But give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I think government was designed as a check and a balance. And right now we don't have that. You have one party that's in charge of the House and the Senate, as well as the White House. And this is what you get under those circumstances. And we need to make sure that we cut the cars, cut the deck on I always said I wanted to make Joe Biden a half-term president, meaning that they can't run ramp shut like that. You need to be working together in a cooperative way. And we don't have that right now, which is why I'm here with Mike Lee today, a solid conservative who votes right and is a member going to decide the majority of the United States Senate. So I think that's how the founding fathers saw this to be done. It wasn't supposed to be for rapid action. It's to be done for deliberate action. We have a huge debt in this country. Inflation numbers are way up again. All of those things are going to have an impact on the future for ourselves, for our kids, and for this country. So, I mean, that's the way I'm focusing and thinking about it now in the bigger picture, to make sure that the Rocky Mountain West is properly represented and doesn't find itself. And even with, what Joe Manchin has been trying to do with his efforts on permitting, he had the FERC taking over transmission lines, but then them setting the rates, which would impact Utah and Wyoming on electricity. If you're transmitting from our wind turbines in Wyoming through Utah, through Nevada to California, then the federal government would set the rates for the power going to California, which you can imagine they would then, under that scenario, have us, all of us, subsidizing renewable energy to California and the higher expenses that you get with that. So elections have consequences, and that's one of the things I've been focused in.
Well, I think we all believe that having people at the table and in the room in DC that understand the West would be immensely helpful for the state of Utah. Senator, I have to tell you, go ahead.
I'll just quickly add a couple of things. So taking out the infrastructure bill, the Great American Outdoors Act, that's one thing that our office has been, actually the last week in September before coming out to the August district work period, we had one of the individuals that we had on committee one time coming in for a witness to really dig in and make the sincere request. How are you making these decisions based on what formulas are you allocating these resources? Because we saw way too much funding go to, get this, the Virginia Parkway. When we have a backlog in our national parks here in Utah, that that is exactly the type of funding that whole entire legislation was designed for. And so there is an oversight role. Our office is keying on it. Our delegation entirely is focused on it. We've done several different outreach letters and really pushing on it. So it's the same way. We're hopeful in years, subsequent years, that we'll see a little more transparency, and we're working on that. With regards to the Great Salt Lake in particular, this bill, that's one thing that I do like about it. We we made sure to make sure that the Salton Sea, like that already has a lot of attention and a lot of funding. And so that was completely taken out of the priority system in the lakes that are being addressed in this across the Western region. And, the resources that this particular study from USGS would address, really do hit on, the priority areas. And so I think maybe we've learned from some of that you can't let it get too far down the road, but putting those constraints on the legislation before it gets to point of passage was key for us. And we were, it's good and sound in the current legislation.
Well, Congressman Moore, and you and I've had this conversation at breakfast a few weeks ago, but I appreciate you and all you've done. And you've had a big impact as a freshman lawmaker back there, and we appreciate it. Senator Barrasso,
Joel and Tim to talk.
well, don't tell them that. But Senator Barrasso, we've never met, and I called a friend of mine this morning and I said, tell me about this guy. And literally what he said to me was, he is the nicest member of the U.S. Senate. The nicest, not taking anything away from you, Senator Lee, but Senator Barrasso is the nicest guy in the U.S. Senate and one of the smartest. And so I do hope that you've got the keys to the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Is that the right title? In January. It would be great for Utah, great for Wyoming, which we love Wyoming. We don't just go there to buy fireworks. We love it for a lot of reasons. In
Wyoming, we say that water is for fighting, whiskey is for drinking. We don't say that in Utah. No.
No, at least not publicly. So, Senator, project into the future, Barrasso, tell us, are there any specific policies or efforts that you see coming down the pike that would help the West in particular deal with some of these complex water issues?
And so much of what additionally I focus with is just the economies in our communities, and energy is a big part of the economy of the Rocky Mountain West. And we're at a point where we have a president who's going overseas to Saudi Arabia and asking for energy there, and Iran and Venezuela and even Russia last year. Water is critical. So is our energy, and that's part of that. We say oil and gas is our bread and butter. Agriculture is such a key part of our heritage. Water plays a critical part of all of that. And it's a matter of how we use water storage, and we do it a lot of in Wyoming as you do it in Utah. We need to make sure that we're not taken advantage of. I mean, we did an agriculture tour today with a local farmer, and the worry, not just here, but nationally, is that the cities are going to go and attack agriculture. And your last panel talked about ag is not our enemy, ag is our friend, but they're very concerned. The whole Family Farm Alliance of the United States is concerned that the cities are coming after rural areas for the water and agriculture being a part of that. Because you take a look at the rivers that come into the Great Salt Lake, 75–85% of that water is agriculture related. Yep. And we got to make sure that they're equal partners in this effort as opposed to enemies.
Thank you. Senator Lee, it's interesting. I wish in some ways you don't really want to know what it's like to be Speaker of the House, trust me. But in a lot of ways, I wish you could kind of see what it's like. One of the great blessings is getting an opportunity to work with our delegation, and Senator Lee is always just extremely willing to help when we call, and the calls come the other direction too. And so, Mike, I just want you to know I appreciate your friendship and support, and you've done a great deal for the state of Utah. When you think about this space of water and the challenges we have with a receding Great Salt Lake, what ideas or policy proposals do you think about that might make sense that you could help with?
Well, again, there are some things we can do in terms of, it's almost a whole of government approach, not literally, because there's some departments of the federal government that aren't involved in it. But there are agricultural programs that have grants that can help us with the habitat conservation issues attached to the shrinking Great Salt Lake. And we've, of course, got the Water Smart grant programs that can help us with the financial end of the water infrastructure development. And then but honestly, I think the biggest single thing we could do would be permitting and NEPA reform to accelerate the process by which one has to go through all these layers of approval in order to build something like this. These issues, fortunately, are not, certainly shouldn't be either Republican or Democratic, either liberal or conservative. These are issues that we as desert dwellers have to deal with. It's a matter of survival. When some of the first settlers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, there were 2 trees here. And we still live in that environment, but we've made it work. We're seeing something now that could make everything not work in a colossal way that could send us into a downward spiral. We have relied not, the tourist benefit, the skiing benefit that we reap from lake effect snow is just the tip of the iceberg. There are all sorts of other ramifications of lake effect snow. When we have a receding footprint of the Great Salt Lake, if that diminishes the amount of lake effect snow that we get, that's also the water that we drink and that we use to irrigate our lawns and crops and everything else. And so that's why this whole of government approach matters, but that's also why it's especially important that we make sure that we've got access, because we can't create new rain. We cannot legislate that into effect. We've got to have means of moving water where it exists to water where we need it. And where we need it right now, a whole lot of it is in the Great Salt Lake.
Thank you. Well, let's have final thoughts. Congressman Moore, let's start with you, and maybe kind of embedded in your final thoughts, you can share any other ideas you have about what we can do from your perspective.
Let me put a little more context on the NEPA stuff to add to that. I recently was on a panel with Representative Curtis and both of our challengers, and we talked extensively about NEPA and over 125 projects that you could label however you want to label these: green, very environmentally friendly, or watershed type of projects, are all being held up by NEPA. The NEPA has overstepped what its intended consequences were. And I recently just had the CEO of Utah Power, which has converted. They're working on 30% right now. They've got it to 30% of their entire portfolio is on renewables. They want to continue that trend, doing it in a way that's affordable. They have a mandate to their customers. They have to keep it affordable. And so I had them come back to speak to a bipartisan group of people, and a couple of Democrats came up to me and said, I really didn't grasp how much work had been done on electric grids, the renewable nature of it, but also what's being limited because of NEPA. And so this is a real concern that is not just a talking point. And I wanted to just try to drive that point home from Senator Lee, that we have major green projects that we're trying to do in Utah being held up by NEPA, and we're better than that. The things that I would want to highlight, just as kind of final thoughts, is this has to be an all-encompassing approach. Nobody's attacking anybody. Every single industry, from the bird migration to the ski industry to the agriculture industry to our front yards, like, we have to be willing to all take a look at it and come together in a collaborative, positive way. That's one of the things that I loved about this process, that our team got involved with this particular piece of legislation that brought in so much of that, from brine shrimp and just was it a company in Ogden, right here, Trace Minerals, that uses this in a very sound, environmentally friendly way, but produces a great product because of this. This is huge. It's important and has big impacts. And however we can continue with these solutions that the state is coming up with, I'm committed, and our team, to be able to lean in where it's appropriate at the federal level and try to get something done. So I just appreciate, honestly, as a way to say thanks to everybody in this room. As we looked at the attendees, you've all played a role in this. And I think it's one of the neatest things that can come together in Utah. So thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Senator Barrasso.
Well, I think when you said it in the earlier panel, said there is no silver bullet. It's not that the federal government can solve these problems, can't. We need to work together to look for the best solutions and in a cooperative way do that. If you look at the kind of the aerial view of the Great Salt Lake, at one point it was over 2,400 square miles. Now it's a little less than 1,000. So the impact is there. It is real. It has impacted everyone. The drought affecting everyone in the Rocky Mountain West. We all get it. We're all in this and trying to find the best solution. So I just appreciate working with the members of your delegation. Michael and I talk every day. He's the head of our steering committee in the Senate. We're on all of these issues on the Energy Committee regularly, meeting hearings. There's clearly going to be huge attention on this issue if we find ourselves in majority through your help and all the work around the country. And then Finally, we cut a great deal. Mike's agreed to take me to Nielsen's for frozen custard, and I've agreed to pay. So we're heading there later.
We're all jealous. So Senator Lee.
I just want to thank my colleague John Barrasso for coming out. His attention to detail on this issue has been consistent with everything we've seen everywhere else. And we look forward to holding hearings on this when he becomes the chairman of the committee, hopefully just in a couple of months. There's a lot of work to do, and we intend to get it done. So thank you very much for doing this and for inviting us to participate.
We're honored you'd be here today. One final observation, if I can. I'm just looking at the three of you, and Senator Barrasso, you got your boots on, and they've got a lot of dust on. You've been out in some farm today, walking around, and I am imagining that that's a good sign that you probably do need the keys to this committee, and more importantly, you understand the West. And so we're glad to have you in the position you're in, regardless of what happens this fall. So thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks. Good job. Good job. Thanks. So nice. Thank you. Good job.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have a brief intermission. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now turn the remainder of our program over to Speaker Wilson. Please welcome him back to the stage.
Well, I hope lunch is good. We're getting close to the final stretch here, folks, and we really appreciate your attention and commitment today to stick it out to the end. I think it's been made abundantly clear to all of us that saving the Great Salt Lake and implementing greater water conservation statewide is not a small task. And it's definitely not something that those in this room or I can do alone. It's going to take a concerted effort across the state. This is a marathon, not a sprint, and it's actually a team effort. It's not something that anyone can go solo on. We know that it's going to take efforts from state, federal, and local leaders, as well as our great nonprofits that have been helping us so far, businesses, and the private sector. And most importantly, it's going to take efforts and commitments from every individual Utahn and their families. The original intent that I had a year ago in hosting the first Great Salt Lake Summit was to bring together stakeholders, to raise awareness, to help us all understand the problem a little bit better, and most importantly, to identify solutions that we can implement to help save the lake. While I think there is absolutely much we can do, we cannot address this generational crisis without the help of all Utahns, every Utah business, every institution, and every individual. So go on a little nostalgic tour with me for a minute. About a decade ago, we faced a different environmental challenge, and it's still out there, but not to the degree that it was. Air quality along the Wasatch Front was continuing to worsen as our population increased. In response, the state launched UCare. UCare educated the public on what they could do to completely, and UCare completely changed the narrative in terms of how we thought about and participated in making our air better. It also added a personal touch. People could now see how their individual actions fit into the larger whole, and remarkably, or maybe unremarkably, it's worked. We've seen our air get better over the last decade because of the efforts of UCare. As I have metaphorically and quite literally waded into the state's water issue, it's become apparent to me that we need a similar coordinated effort around water. I'm excited to announce that we'll be sponsoring legislation this coming session to create Utah waterways. This legislation will provide a structure for grant programs and efficient lines of communication among all of the stakeholders. It will work to better engage the public on their role on what they can do to help solve our water issues. And we will also work with businesses to implement water-wise practices. We have learned in this state for sure the value of public-private partnerships. As I said earlier, if we're smart, if we work together, And if we can listen to each other, we can grow and protect the amazing natural resources of Utah. While still in the beginning stages, I'm extremely happy and grateful to announce some founding corporate sponsors and members of our community who've committed to a multi-year, multi-million-dollar contribution to Utah waterways. If I could have Josh Brown from Rio Tinto, Lisa Nichols from Intermountain Healthcare, Robert Bischoff from Zions Bank, Michael Parker from Ivory Homes, and Amanda Covington from the Larry H. Miller Group come up to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for these individuals and businesses. As Teresa described earlier when we got started today, our water resources are all interconnected. So I also believe our approach to solving this problem should be solving our water crisis with great partners publicly and privately. As part of this exciting announcement, when you leave today, we'll be giving you a collector's item you'll want to save for future generations, a sticker for your water bottle with the new Utah Waterways logo. But before we conclude this section, I want to turn some time over to one of these individuals, Amanda Covington, to just share her perspective on why her organization decided to commit and participate in this effort. Amanda?
Speaker, thank you. And it's an honor to be on stage with these incredible organizations and companies. We know in Utah that when there's a call for action that we can come together and do incredible things. We appreciate the speaker's leadership as well as all of our decision makers and elected officials here, and the fact that you're coming together to talk about water, because we know that water is our business. We also are strong proponents of public-private partnerships. It's not only government and business, but it's also nonprofits, associations, and the philanthropies that surround us. And we have seen through the past few legislative sessions some really incredible projects that have come to bear. And we know that this initiative and program will do incredible things for our state. So we're honored to be on the ground floor, and we encourage the rest of you to join on and be partners with us.
Thank you, Amanda. You know, we are so fortunate to live in a state where you can make a call, and on the first call, the first ask, all of their organizations said, we'd love to participate. We care about the state and we want to help with this issue, which is arguably not actually inarguably the biggest issue I think we face in the state today. Let's give it up one more time for Rio Tinto, Intermountain Healthcare, Zions Bank, Ivory Homes, and the Larry H. Miller Group. Some great folks. I've said 100 times, and I'll probably say 100 more, that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Everybody has a role to play. Everybody owns a piece of the puzzle in the effort to protect the Great Salt Lake and conserving water all over the state of Utah. When I think about our future, I'm very optimistic. While you or I may never completely see the impacts of the work that we're helping with right now, this is simply not a race that we can afford to lose. We must be smart. We must work together. We must listen to one another so we can grow and protect the natural resources and water resources and leave Utah a better place for our kids, our grandchildren, and future generations. With your help, I know that we're going to figure this out, cross the finish line together. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your commitment to the state of Utah, for your interest in this issue and being so supportive of our efforts. Have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for the second annual Great Salt Lake Summit. For those interested, a copy of today's proceedings will be posted on the Utah House Majority Facebook page. Thank you for attending and drive safely.